Because you are the strong one, Miyuki. I am the face of the business. You are the cleanup crew. That is how this family works. The audio plays back through my phone speaker, crisp, unbothered. The voice belongs to my older sister, Elena. I tap the glass screen and the blue sound wave flattens into a straight, silent line. That is the sound of a federal crime being confessed in a hotel conference room. But to understand the precise mechanics of how we arrived at that recording, you have to look at the ledger that started it all. My name is Miyuki Garcia. I am 31 years old, and before I tell you how my parents held a living funeral to bury me, I need you to know I am the one who eventually audited their ghosts. Welcome back to Morning Revenge, where we read the receipts people thought they shredded. If you have ever been designated the family scapegoat just because you carry weight without complaining, this story is for you. Drop a comment below, tell me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe to hear exactly how this debt gets settled. Now let me take you back 6 years to a windowless office in Texas. I was 25, working as a junior clerk for my parents' logistics firm. Javier and Rosa Garcia ran a fleet of freight trucks. The business survived on diesel fuel, tight vendor margins, and my sister's manufactured crises. Javier handled dispatch, complaining over Sunday dinners about shrinking corporate accounts. Rosa managed the books, though managed implies a level of scrutiny she refused to apply to Elena. Elena held the title of Vice President of Operations without ever stepping foot onto a loading dock. The fracture happened on a Tuesday in early November. A routine reconciliation flagged a missing transfer. $45,000 had drained from the company primary operating account. I tracked the routing sequence, expecting to find a simple vendor typo. Instead, I found a chain of forwarded emails carefully doctored to look like I had authorized the wire to an offshore equipment supplier. Elena had panicked. She engineered a digital paper trail, pinning her theft on the junior clerk who happened to share her last name. I did not yell. I did not storm through the hallway. I simply printed the raw server metadata, pages of IP logs, time-stamped access codes, and routing headers, concrete proof. I carried the stack of paper into my father's office. The room smelled of stale coffee and the sharp tang of cheap printer ink. Rosa sat beside him. Elena stood near the bookshelf, arms crossed tight against her designer blazer. I set the papers on the mahogany desk. I pointed to the IP address attached to the wire authorization, matching it digit for digit to the laptop issued to the Vice President of Operations. Javier did not read the logs. Rosa did not even glance at the timestamps. Instead, Elena inhaled a sharp, theatrical breath. She covered her face with both of her perfectly manicured hands and began to weep. Her shoulders shook. The tears fell fast and heavy, a flawless performance of a betrayed sibling. Truth in our house was never a matter of empirical evidence. It was an auction won by whoever cried the loudest. Javier pushed the stack of metadata off his desk. The papers scattered across the industrial carpet with a dry whisper. He looked at me with cold, exhausted disappointment. Rosa rushed out of her chair to wrap her arms around Elena, shielding the thief from the auditor. I stood there feeling the heavy silence of that room press into my chest. My hands hung empty at my sides. I learned the fundamental rule of the Garcia family that afternoon. A pristine record means nothing if it threatens the innocence of the favorite child. The missing money was just the opening act. The real cost would be collected 5 days later, served on a dining room table in front of our entire family. I received the summons on a Thursday evening, a brief text message from my mother dictating my attendance at Sunday dinner. There was no invitation in her tone, only a rigid expectation of compliance. In the days following my discovery of the forged wire transfer, the office had operated in a suffocating silence. Javier communicated with me only through short handwritten notes dropped on my desk. Rosa averted her gaze whenever we crossed paths in the break room. Elena simply did not come into work, using her manufactured trauma as a shield against the corporate hours. I spent those days waiting for the other shoe to drop, unaware that my parents were not preparing a reprimand, they were preparing a burial. Sunday arrived with the oppressive, suffocating heat typical of late autumn in Texas. I parked my reliable sedan at the end of the long concrete driveway beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree my father had planted when I was in kindergarten. The house looked exactly as it always did. Red brick, pristine landscaping, the heavy oak front door, polished to a dull shine. My stomach tightened into a hard knot, a physical warning system I had learned to ignore for 25 years. I turned off the ignition, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and forced myself to breathe evenly. I walked up the pathway, turned the brass knob, and stepped inside the home where I had grown up. The air conditioning hit my skin first, followed immediately by the scent of roasted garlic and braised pork. It was the smell of celebration of holidays and milestones. But the sensory comfort shattered the moment I looked at the walls of the entry hallway. The floral wallpaper was covered in faded pale rectangles. I stopped breathing. For a long moment, my brain failed to process the visual data. The hallway had always been my mother's gallery of achievements, the heavy mahogany frames used to hold a timeline of our lives. But every single photograph containing my face had been removed. The space where my high school valedictorian portrait had hung for 7 years was nothing but an empty lighter patch of beige wallpaper. The picture of me holding my college diploma, gone. The candid snapshot of Elena and me building a snowman during a rare Texas freeze, gone. The brass hooks remained screwed into the drywall, holding nothing but empty air. They had not just taken down the frames, they had scrubbed the walls of my existence. My hands grew cold. A strange, ringing numbness spread outward from my chest. I traced my fingers over one of the faded rectangles, feeling the faint outline of dust that remained. This was not a sudden fit of rage. This was a methodical, premeditated erasure. I walked past the empty hooks and stepped into the dining room. The heavy oak table was fully extended, set with Rosa's best porcelain plates and crystal wine glasses. The room was crowded. Aunt Sophia sat near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Uncle Hector stared intently at the woven placemat in front of him. My cousins David and Maria shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed chairs, and there, seated at the right hand of my father, was Elena. She wore a soft, pale blue dress, her makeup done to emphasize the dark circles under her eyes, casting her as the exhausted survivor of a terrible ordeal. She looked up when I entered, and for a fraction of a second, the corner of her mouth twitched upward into a razor-thin smirk. The low murmur of conversation died the instant my shoes scuffed the hardwood floor. Nobody greeted me. Aunt Sophia actively turned her head to look out the window. I stood at the threshold, an uninvited stranger in a room full of people who shared my blood. Javier stood up from the head of the table. He did not look angry. He looked solemn, carrying the practiced grief of a patriarch forced to make a terrible decision. He reached for his wine glass, lifting it toward the low-hanging chandelier. The crystal caught the light, a brilliant, distracting sparkle in a room suffocating on tension. He cleared his throat. The sound echoed off the high ceiling. "Today we are gathered to support family," Javier began, his voice resonant and steady. "We have survived a terrible betrayal this week, a betrayal that threatens the livelihood of this business and the legacy I have built. We expected loyalty. We received theft." He paused, letting the heavy accusation hang over the roasted pork and the silver cutlery. My chest seized. He was not just protecting Elena in private anymore. He was canonizing her lie in front of the extended family. He was cementing the narrative that I was the thief, using the audience to make the verdict permanent. Javier turned his head and looked directly at Elena. His eyes softened. He raised the glass a fraction higher. To Elena, he said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion, "The strong one, the loyal one, the only daughter we have left." The words struck the center of my chest with the force of a physical blow. The only daughter we have left. Aunt Sophia raised her water glass in a hesitant, shaking toast. Uncle Hector followed suit. They were drinking to my death while I stood less than 10 feet away. They were holding a living funeral, sacrificing my name and my future to protect the golden child from the consequences of her own embezzlement. I did not scream. I did not demand they look at the server logs still sitting in my car. I realized with a freezing clear logic that no amount of proof could penetrate a delusion this protected. From the kitchen doorway, Rosa emerged. She did not carry a platter of food. She carried a large black plastic garbage bag. The shiny material rustled loudly in the silent room. She walked around the perimeter of the dining table, avoiding my gaze, and stopped 2 feet in front of me. She thrust the bag toward my chest. I raised my hands instinctively to catch it. The bag was light. Inside, I could feel the soft yarn of the 3 sweaters I had left in my old bedroom closet, along with a pair of running shoes and a hardcover novel. "We packed your things," Rosa said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any maternal warmth. Her eyes were hard, fixed on the collar of my shirt rather than my face. "You are no longer welcome in this house. You are no longer part of this business. Do not call us." She turned her back on me and walked to her seat next to Javier. The black plastic crinkled in my grip. I looked at the faces of my family. I looked at Elena, who was taking a delicate sip of red wine, her eyes shining with quiet, triumphant satisfaction. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to fall to my knees to beg for forgiveness for a crime I did not commit, to cry and shatter so they could feel justified in their cruelty. I refused to give them the performance they paid for. I tightened my grip on the garbage bag. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single word of defense or farewell. I simply turned around on the hardwood floor, walked back down the hallway of faded rectangles, and let the heavy oak front door click shut behind me. The humid Texas air hit my lungs like a physical release. I walked down the concrete driveway, tossed the black bag into the trunk of my sedan, and climbed into the driver's seat. I inserted the key, turned the ignition, and listened to the steady hum of the engine. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back at the house in the rearview mirror. I drove onto the interstate, pointing the hood of my car east. I drove past the sprawling suburbs of Houston, past the oil refineries glowing against the darkening sky. I kept my foot pressed against the accelerator, letting the white lines of the highway blur into a continuous stream. I crossed the state line into Louisiana just after midnight, the tires humming a steady, rhythmic drone over the asphalt. Hours later, the welcoming sign for Mississippi loomed in the headlights. Somewhere along that dark stretch of highway, the girl who craved her parents' approval quietly expired. The Garcia family had declared me dead, and I chose to accept the diagnosis. I changed my phone number. I abandoned my corporate email. I packed my flawless credit score and my auditing skills into a new life on the Gulf Coast. I decided that if I had to be a corpse, I was going to be a ghost that haunted a different state. I spent the next 6 years building a life of undeniable documented truth. I built a fortress of compliance and verifiability. The grave stayed quiet for a very long time. But the thing about family secrets is that they never truly stay buried. The debts always accrue interest, and 6 years later, the silence would finally break, ringing through my unlisted cell phone, signaling that the people who buried me had suddenly run out of dirt. 6 years is a long time to remain dead. I drove until the dry heat of Texas surrendered to the thick coastal humidity of Mississippi, determined to find a place where my surname blended into the background. Gulfport offered exactly what I required. It was a city that held no historical weight for me, no reputation to uphold, no whispered legacy of a family logistics empire. I shed my old identity the way a snake discards dead skin. I traded the suffocating expectations of my parents for a reality built solely on verifiable metrics. I became a senior medical compliance auditor for a regional healthcare network spanning 3 counties. My office sits on the 4th floor, featuring a large window that overlooks a concrete parking garage and a rigid line of palm trees. My daily routine consists of dismantling financial illusions. When a surgical department overbills for generic anesthesia, I find the discrepancy. When an outpatient clinic attempts to hide unauthorized overtime in a supply budget, I highlight the exact cell on the spreadsheet. The hospital executives believe I am merely dedicated to protecting their bottom line. They do not realize that my proficiency stems from a deep psychological allergy to deception. Numbers do not weep in my office. They do not cross their arms and throw tantrums to avoid accountability. They simply add up, or they confess their discrepancy. I built a formidable reputation by demanding daylight in a corporate structure that naturally preferred shadows. At work functions, people inevitably ask about your origins. It is a standard social transaction. During a holiday luncheon, a colleague named Sarah, an amiable pediatric nurse with a habit of bringing glazed donuts to the break room, asked if I missed my family during the winter months. I stood by the coffee machine, watching the dark liquid fill my paper cup. I kept my gaze fixed on the rising steam. "My parents passed away," I told her, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I am an only child." Sarah touched my forearm, offering genuine soft sympathy, and she never brought the subject up again. Using the past tense was technically accurate regarding the relationship my parents themselves had terminated on that Sunday afternoon. It kept the invasive questions at bay. It maintained the sterile, protective perimeter I needed to function. The salary of a senior auditor afforded me a specific kind of sanctuary. I purchased a small single-story house 3 blocks from the water. It featured a weathered wooden porch, heavy storm shutters, and a yard enclosed by a tall, reinforced cedar fence. I did not decorate the interior with family heirlooms or framed portraits. The walls remained a stark, calming white, a deliberate rejection of the faded rectangles lining my mother's hallway. My only companion was a retired racing greyhound named Silas. I adopted him because greyhounds understand the profound value of a quiet retirement. Silas spent his days sleeping on an orthopedic bed in the corner of my living room, asking for nothing but a strict routine and a daily walk along the concrete seawall. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a glass of ice water, watching Silas monitor the yard. I listened to the distant sound of the Gulf tide breaking against the sand. The coastal air always smelled faintly of salt and wet pavement. It was a beautiful, meticulously structured piece. Yet, a quiet anxiety always hummed beneath the floorboards of my new life. You can construct a fortress, but a true auditor knows that structural integrity is only as strong as its weakest liability. My hidden liability was a piece of paper signed when I was 21 years old. Before I understood the toxic machinery of the family business, I had desperately craved my parents' trust. During my first month as a junior clerk, Javier had called me into his office. The room smelled of his expensive cologne and old leather. He handed me a heavy blue pen and a thick stack of bank forms. He framed the request as a rite of passage, a graduation into the inner circle of the company. A joint corporate account, he had explained, his voice thick with patriarchal pride. He claimed the business required a backup signatory for vendor wires, in case he and Rosa were traveling out of state. I signed on the dotted line. I glowed with the foolish pride of a daughter who thought she was finally being valued as an equal. I did not understand I was merely signing up to be a legal shield. In the state of Texas, a joint corporate account requires the physical signatures of all account holders to formally close. When Rosa handed me that black garbage bag and ordered me to vanish, I assumed they had severed my financial ties along with my familial ones. I assumed they marched into the bank, presented the articles of incorporation, and removed my name from their ledger. But assumptions are the cardinal sin of compliance. Without their physical signatures and a notary stamp, I could not legally verify the account was shut down. I could not simply call the banking institution and demand a closure without triggering a mandatory notification letter to Javier and Rosa. Contacting the bank would break my perimeter. It would send a flare into the Texas sky, signaling to the ghosts that I was still breathing. So I boxed up that fear. In the master bedroom of my Gulfport house, tucked deep inside the closet behind a row of dry-cleaned winter coats, I bolted a heavy, fireproof safe directly to the floorboards. Inside that steel box, I kept a single manila folder. It contained the original printed server metadata from the $45,000 theft, the IP logs, the timestamps, the routing headers proving Elena executed the wire transfer. I kept the folder safe from hurricanes, seasonal floods, and the passage of time. I told myself it was merely a psychological comfort, a tangible reminder that I was not crazy, that the theft had been real, and that my exile was unjust. I did not know it then, but I was building a storm shelter. Deep in the analytical center of my brain, the fear persisted. You cannot outrun a shared ledger simply by crossing a state line. A dormant account is a loaded weapon sitting in a dark drawer, waiting for someone desperate enough to pull the trigger. The quiet rhythm of my coastal life was a statistical anomaly. I spent 40 hours a week enforcing rules and chasing overdue balances, which meant I understood a universal, unavoidable law of mathematics. Unpaid debts never just disappear. Eventually, they go to collections, and the people who buried me were about to send the bill. The silence of 6 years broke on a humid Thursday in late September. Gulfport was trapped in the stagnant, heavy atmosphere that always precedes coastal storm systems. Inside my fourth-floor hospital office, the climate control maintained a crisp, artificial chill. I sat at my dual monitors, cross-referencing Medicare billing codes for a regional orthopedic clinic. The task required intense focus, matching surgical supply invoices against patient discharge charts. Then my personal cell phone illuminated on the corner of the desk. I glanced at the screen, expecting a notification from the veterinary clinic regarding my greyhound Silas. Instead, stark black numbers glowed against the glass. The area code was from Texas. A sharp physical jolt struck the base of my neck. My fingers stopped typing. I stared at the device as it vibrated against the polished wood of my desk, emitting a low, rhythmic hum. The hospital network operated on a strict firewall, both digitally and socially. My personal number was unlisted, unregistered on any public social media platform, and tied to a private post office box rather than my residential address. The only entities possessing these 10 digits were my mortgage lender, the utility companies, and my dog's veterinarian. I did not touch the device. I sat perfectly still and let it ring until it rolled to voicemail. The screen went dark. I exhaled a slow, controlled breath, attempting to attribute the call to a random telemarketer or an automated spam dialer. I returned my hands to the keyboard. 3 minutes later, the screen illuminated again. Same area code, same relentless vibration. Over the course of 2 hours, that unknown Texas number dialed my phone 14 separate times. It was a digital siege. The sheer frequency eliminated any possibility of a misdial. Someone was actively, desperately trying to breach my perimeter. The auditor inside my brain demanded I gather data rather than react with panic. I did not block the caller ID. Blocking is a defensive maneuver that signals a human is actively managing the line. I wanted to see how far the aggressor would push the boundary. On the 15th attempt, the caller finally left a message. A small red icon appeared on my screen. The visual confirmation of a voicemail felt like a physical intrusion in my sterile office. I stood up, walked to the heavy wooden door, and turned the deadbolt lock. I lowered the window blinds, shutting out the view of the palm trees and the concrete parking structure. I returned to my leather chair, picked up the phone, and tapped the play button, bringing the speaker to my ear. The audio began with a sharp, ragged intake of breath, followed immediately by the sound of weeping. It was my mother. I was listening to Rosa Garcia speak for the first time in over 2,000 days. She was not calling to apologize for holding a living funeral. She was not calling to express regret for erasing my face from the hallway of our childhood home. Rosa was deploying the specific weaponized crying she always utilized when Elena had broken something too expensive to fix. It was a tactical sound engineered to bypass logic and trigger immediate guilt in the listener. It lacked the genuine guttural weight of true grief. The cadence was entirely theatrical, a calculated performance of maternal distress. "Miyuki, please pick up," her voice crackled through the tiny speaker vibrating against my jawbone. "Your sister has destroyed everything. Please, you have to help us." The recording ended with a frantic click. I lowered the phone and set it back on the desk. The silence in the locked office felt thicker than before. I analyzed the brief recording with forensic detachment. I examined the syntax of her message, focusing on the glaring omissions. Rosa did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I was healthy, married, or even happy. After half a decade of treating me like a discarded corpse, her very first instinct upon discovering I was alive was to reach into the dirt and hand me a shovel. They did not want their daughter back. They wanted the cleanup crew. The golden child had evidently shattered the logistics empire, and the parents needed the scapegoat to sweep up the broken glass. A new, infinitely more dangerous question immediately replaced the shock of hearing her voice. How did Rosa acquire my unlisted number? My coastal sanctuary was constructed on a foundation of deliberate obscurity. I paid extra fees to keep my data scrubbed from commercial data brokers. I did not use my legal name on consumer reward programs. An ordinary person sitting in a Texas suburb could not simply open a search engine and locate my direct contact information. I opened a new tab on my secure hospital workstation and logged into my personal credit monitoring portal. As a compliance professional, I maintain premium real-time alerts on my financial footprint. I bypassed the standard dashboard and navigated straight to the raw inquiry logs. I scrolled past the routine checks from my mortgage servicer and my credit card issuer. There it was, a fresh hard inquiry log just 48 hours prior. The requesting entity was not a bank. It was a licensed skip tracing firm based out of Houston. a specialized agency typically hired by bail bondsmen and aggressive debt collectors to locate individuals who actively wish to remain hidden. Skip tracers have access to proprietary databases, utility hookup records, and localized municipal tax registries. Elena had hired a professional hunter. The realization reorganized the architecture of my fear. My sister had taken the last remaining funds from their collapsing logistics company and spent them on a digital mercenary to breach my firewall. This was not a casual attempt to reconnect. This was a targeted extraction. If a professional skip tracer had provided them with my cellular data, they undoubtedly provided the rest of the file. The agency would have handed over my employment history, my current workplace, and the exact street coordinates of my home near the water. My hands grew cold. I looked at the drawn window blinds of my office, realizing the physical distance between Texas and Mississippi suddenly meant absolutely nothing. The machinery of my family had located my coordinates. They had paid for a map to my front door. The 14 phone calls were not just desperate pleas, they were a test to see if the phone line was active. By leaving the voicemail, Rosa was confirming the target was locked. I closed the browser tab and deleted the credit report logs from my temporary cache. I unlocked my office door, the heavy metal deadbolt sliding back with a sharp click that sounded far too loud in the quiet corridor. The hospital continued functioning around me. Nurses charted medications, physicians reviewed lab results. Nobody knew that the senior auditor was standing in the center of her department, bracing for an incoming hurricane. The ghosts were no longer satisfied with haunting Texas. They were driving toward the Gulf Coast. My perimeter was officially breached, setting the stage for a physical confrontation I could no longer avoid. The sanctuary was compromised, and the people who buried me were coming to demand a resurrection. The 72 hours following that menacing voicemail felt akin to wading through rapidly setting concrete. Every shadow cast across the clinical corridors of my workplace seemed to harbor a hidden adversary. I intentionally varied my daily commute, steering my vehicle along circuitous routes, hugging the coastal highway, my eyes continuously darting toward the rearview mirror. To fortify my residence, I authorized the immediate installation of a stringent security perimeter. Motion-activated floodlights now bracketed my driveway, engineered to bathe the property in a blinding white glare should anything breach the boundary line. The professional skip tracer had effectively handed my family a detailed map to my front door, leaving me in a state of agonizing suspense, perpetually waiting for the invasion to commence. However, the anticipated assault did not occur at my heavily fortified dwelling. The opposition selected a far more vulnerable public arena. Twilight arrived prematurely on Monday evening, pulling a dense blanket of slate-gray storm clouds across the southern sky. I departed the administrative wing shortly after 6 o'clock. The atmospheric humidity was incredibly oppressive, pressing against my exposed skin like a suffocating damp shroud. I navigated toward the multi-story employee parking structure, my professional heels clicking a solitary echoing rhythm against the bare concrete floors. Overhead rows of industrial sodium vapor lamps flickered erratically, projecting long, jaundiced yellow shadows between the massive support pillars. The enclosed space carried the distinct metallic scent of vehicle exhaust, mixed with the heavy promise of impending rain. My reliable sedan occupied a space on the second tier, a secluded corner I deliberately favored due to its immediate proximity to the emergency stairwell. As I rounded the final structural column, my practice stride abruptly faltered. The steady cadence of my footsteps completely ceased. My respiratory system temporarily forgot how to process oxygen. A solitary figure was actively leaning against the driver's side panel of my automobile. Despite the dismal, sickly illumination provided by the garage fixtures, the specific silhouette was instantly recognizable. I observed the rigid, uncompromising posture, the defensive folding of the arms, and the expensive designer handbag clutched securely against her ribcage, acting as a makeshift shield. It was the exact individual who had previously handed me a plastic refuse bag and ruthlessly banished me from the only home I knew. Rosa Garcia was occupying my designated safe space. Witnessing the primary architect of my living funeral infiltrating my meticulously constructed sanctuary delivered a psychological blow carrying the staggering density of a falling boulder. Half a decade of carefully engineered distance instantaneously evaporated. My instinct urged flight, but the trained auditor residing within my prefrontal cortex demanded I objectively assess the immediate threat. I compelled my rigid legs to function, advancing deliberately across the slick, oil-stained pavement. As the physical gap narrowed, the visual data snapped into terrifyingly sharp resolution. The passage of time had treated the matriarch of the logistics empire with extreme cruelty. The arrogant, untouchable sheen she previously wore during that infamous Sunday dinner had entirely vanished. Her tailored charcoal blazer appeared thoroughly rumpled, hanging loosely upon a skeletal frame that had visibly deteriorated. Dark, bruised hollows encircled her eyes, closely mirroring the manufactured exhaustion Elena had weaponized years prior. Except on Rosa's deteriorating face, the sheer fatigue radiated a terrifying authenticity. Before I possessed the opportunity to engage my electronic key fob and unlock the reinforced doors, the woman unexpectedly lunged forward, her hand clamped aggressively onto my left forearm. The physical grip possessed shocking strength, her manicured fingernails biting deeply through the woven fabric of my professional attire. "You must listen to me," she gasped, the syllables tumbling outward in a frantic, entirely disorganized torrent. Her shallow breath carried the faint, desperate odor of stale peppermint, intertwined with raw panic. "Please, Miyuki, I possess absolutely nowhere else to run." I directed an icy stare toward the appendages restricting my movement. This contact represented a profound, unforgivable violation of the very boundary they had drawn themselves. "Remove your fingers," I instructed, my vocal register dropping a full octave, sounding hollow and completely devoid of any familial warmth. She instinctively snatched her hands backward, as though the fabric emitted a lethal voltage. Yet the frantic verbal barrage did not decelerate. The dam shattered, spilling the catastrophic disaster she had transported across 2 state lines directly onto my footwear. The original $45,000 Elena misappropriated functioned merely as a prologue, a microscopic indiscretion when compared against the absolute devastation that ultimately followed. Throughout the ensuing 6 years, the family enterprise had been systematically butchered. Their corporate operating accounts were entirely hollowed out, maliciously drained via phantom vendor invoices, falsified shipping logs, and lavish unearned executive bonuses. "We are currently submerged $600,000 in debt." Rosa sobbed her high-pitched wail, ricocheting sharply against the low concrete ceiling overhead. The primary lending institution is officially initiating commercial foreclosure protocols on the main distribution warehouse next Tuesday. We are forfeiting the entire transportation fleet. We are losing absolutely everything. I maintained a fiercely rigid, entirely unreadable facial expression, quietly calculating the staggering magnitude of their financial collapse. $600,000 was never an accidental accounting oversight. Such a deficit required a sustained, highly deliberate campaign of aggressive embezzlement. Then she revealed the true catastrophe, the specific detail elevating their localized crisis from a standard civil dispute into a catastrophic federal nightmare. Rosa leaned a fraction closer, her bloodshot eyes darting nervously toward the vacant stairwell entrance. "The Internal Revenue Service is presently auditing the firm. The investigators located the concealed offshore accounts. We are officially facing federal tax evasion indictments. The mandatory sentencing guidelines alone will condemn your father to a federal penitentiary for the remainder of his natural life." This massive revelation theoretically should have elicited profound shock, yet my analytical mind instantaneously detected the glaring structural anomaly within her presentation. Why was she standing here? If the empire was actively burning to the ground, why traverse multiple highways merely to confess this failure to the discarded offspring? Rosa evidently sensed my profound freezing detachment and rapidly pivoted, deploying a masterfully crafted psychological decoy. "It was Javier," she whispered conspiratorially, salty tears finally breaching the dam and carving dark mascara-stained pathways down her pallid cheeks. "He personally orchestrated the entire fraudulent scheme. He utilized the company capital to satisfy horrific underground gambling obligations. When the government agents delivered the initial inquiry notice, he panicked. He is currently forcing Elena to accept the criminal culpability. He deliberately doctored the internal ledgers to make it appear as though she unilaterally authorized the illegal wire transfers. He intends to let the prosecutors lock your poor sister inside a concrete cell solely to preserve his own pristine reputation. This narrative constituted a brilliantly constructed red herring explicitly designed to exploit my established history as the designated scapegoat. My mother was aggressively attempting to build a sympathetic parallel, linking Elena's current jeopardy with my previous trauma. She desperately required me to perceive the favored offspring as a fellow casualty of Javier's tyrannical machinery. The goal was to manufacture pity for the exact sibling who had gleefully framed me 6 years earlier. It represented a staggering, breathtaking display of emotional manipulation, but the story lacked the most crucial ingredient: empirical truth. I had securely preserved the original server logs inside my fireproof safe. I possessed concrete knowledge identifying the true thief, and the perpetrator was undeniably not the aging patriarch. Javier was certainly guilty of blinding toxic nepotism, but Elena remained the undisputed singular architect of the massive fraud. "And what precise action do you expect me to execute regarding this tragedy?" I inquired, my enunciation remaining clipped, frozen, and merciless. Rosa violently swiped the moisture from her chin, her entire demeanor morphing instantaneously from a grieving, shattered mother into a ruthless, calculating negotiator. The private investigator explained your current occupation. "We are fully aware of your senior title at the medical network. We authorized a soft inquiry concerning your background. Your personal credit score is utterly flawless, Miyuki. The metric is absolutely pristine." The genuine motivation driving this ambush finally materialized beneath the buzzing defective lighting fixtures. "We require you to urgently secure a massive personal bridge loan," Rosa pleaded aggressively, clasping her palms together in a grotesque theatrical parody of religious prayer. "We only need sufficient liquid capital to instantly satisfy the immediate government penalties and halt the criminal indictment proceedings. Once the federal agents withdraw their scrutiny, we need you to temporarily shelter the surviving commercial vehicles under your legal name. Your financial history is completely spotless. The regulatory authorities will never look twice at your filings. We promise to reimburse every single penny. I swear this oath upon my eternal soul. We merely need to utilize your identity to harbor the physical assets until this catastrophic storm safely passes." The profound silence following her staggering request felt absolute, interrupted only by the muffled, distant roar of evening traffic traversing the nearby coastal thoroughfare. The sheer, unadulterated audacity fueling the demand generated a wave of physical nausea within my stomach. These people had aggressively stripped my name from their residence, violently erased my existence from their collective history, and hosted a public ceremony to officially declare me deceased. Yet the exact moment their own unchecked corruption threatened to consume them, they traversed state lines, seeking to resurrect the buried corpse. They did not travel this immense distance out of maternal longing. They did not hire a mercenary tracker to mend a shattered relationship. They hunted me down for a singular, chillingly clinical objective. The ghosts haunting my parking garage did not seek emotional absolution or familial forgiveness. The family simply desired to rent my unblemished perfect record to successfully launder their spectacular criminal failures. I stared downward at the trembling woman positioned beside my vehicle, fully comprehending the lethal, inescapable snare she was attempting to deploy. Agreeing to this horrific proposition would not merely drain my savings, it would legally tether me directly to their federal offenses, permanently transforming my peaceful coastal sanctuary into a restrictive prison cell. The enormous boulder had been forcefully dropped directly onto my path, presenting an impossible ultimatum. I must either submit to their financial extortion or officially declare thermonuclear war against the individuals who originally provided my DNA. I refused to conduct a high-stakes negotiation in the damp confines of a municipal parking facility. I instructed the weeping woman to follow my exact trajectory without uttering another syllable. We relocated to a 24-hour dining establishment situated directly opposite the main entrance of my medical campus. I required a brilliantly illuminated environment strictly to observe the granular mechanics of her rising panic under unforgiving fluorescent bulbs. The interior smelled heavily of oxidized frying oil, scorched coffee beans, and aggressive industrial bleach. We selected a booth positioned far away from the front windows, sinking into cracked vinyl seating that hissed under our combined weight. A waitress wearing a severely stained yellow apron approached our table, deposited 2 massive ceramic mugs of lukewarm water, and vanished without requesting our food order. Rosa immediately wrapped her trembling fingers around her glass, clutching the thick material as though it were a flotation device amidst a raging ocean. The harsh overhead lighting was remarkably cruel to her deteriorating facade. I watched a single droplet of condensation glide slowly down the exterior of her cup, mirroring the cold, detached calculation currently operating within my own mind. I sat perfectly motionless across from her, keeping my hands folded calmly atop the sticky formica surface. I was actively analyzing a predator who had suddenly discovered the agonizing reality of becoming prey. For the entirety of my childhood, Rosa had functioned as the supreme architect of our domestic reality, constructing a universe where Elena existed as an infallible deity and I served as the mandatory sacrifice for every single mistake. When I was 11 years old, my older sibling intentionally shattered an antique porcelain vase our grandmother had imported from Madrid. Instead of accepting the consequences, she methodically placed the largest, sharpest ceramic shards directly beneath my bedroom door, subsequently informing our parents I had destroyed the heirloom during a childish temper tantrum. I spent that entire summer grounded, barred from attending neighborhood activities, while the actual culprit received a generous allowance increase for demonstrating alleged emotional maturity during a family crisis. That historical incident established the permanent blueprint for their survival strategy. Now sitting in this greasy coastal eatery, the matriarch was aggressively attempting to deploy that exact same blueprint on a catastrophic federal scale. She reached into her oversized designer handbag, the expensive leather audibly scraping against the table edge. She extracted a thick, leather-bound folio, pushing it nervously across the median, separating us. "These are the current corporate ledgers," she whispered, her vocal cords straining against the immense weight of their impending bankruptcy. "Every single fraudulent transaction, every fabricated vendor invoice, every manipulated shipping manifest is documented right here. You can review the catastrophic math yourself, Miyuki. You possess the analytical skill set to comprehend the absolute totality of our ruin." She was offering me unfettered access to their financial autopsy, desperately hoping the sheer magnitude of their destruction would finally trigger my dormant subservient programming. She fundamentally believed I would examine the astronomical deficit and instantly volunteer to absorb the lethal impact. Before I could vocalize a definitive, crushing rejection, a sudden, violent vibration rattled the table. The screen of my cellular device illuminated, casting a pale bluish glow against the scratched formica. The caller identification displayed the identical Texas area code that had relentlessly bombarded my private line earlier that afternoon. The skip tracer had clearly provided my contact information to the entire syndicate. I did not hesitate. I reached forward, swiped the glass screen to accept the connection, and engaged the speakerphone function, deliberately placing the device squarely between the business ledgers and my mother's trembling hands. If Rosa was the designated weeping negotiator deployed to soften the target, Elena was undeniably the ruthless extortionist waiting in the wings to execute the final lethal blow. Her voice erupted from the tiny audio driver, sharp, frantic, and completely devoid of any introductory pleasantries. The auditory quality was perfectly crisp, carrying the unmistakable venomous arrogance I had successfully avoided for over 2,000 days. "You need to authorize that bridge loan immediately," the golden child demanded the aggressive command, echoing slightly within the plastic booth. "There is 0 time remaining for your typical self-righteous hesitation. The government auditors are arriving at the corporate headquarters on Monday morning. We require liquid capital deposited into the operational accounts by Friday afternoon to avoid an immediate asset freeze." I leaned marginally closer to the electronic device, my facial expression remaining entirely composed. "Hello to you as well, Elena," I replied, my tone deliberately mirroring the sterile, unbothered cadence I utilized when informing a hospital executive they had violated a severe compliance statute. "I am currently occupied having water with the woman who previously handed me a garbage bag and banished me from the state of Texas." A sharp, derisive scoff transmitted through the connection. "You can drop the victim routine, Miyuki. It is thoroughly exhausting and completely useless right now. We are dealing with federal agents, not a high school guidance counselor. You are going to sign the financing paperwork, and you are going to transfer the funds. If you refuse to cooperate, I guarantee I will burn your quiet little coastal life straight to the ground." I felt Rosa flinch violently on the opposite side of the table, her gaze dropping downward in a supreme display of manufactured cowardice. She was fully aware of the impending threat. This was a highly coordinated ambush. Elena did not wait for my response. She accelerated her verbal assault, eagerly deploying the weapon they had specifically engineered for this exact moment. "You honestly believed you could just vanish, didn't you? You thought moving to Mississippi and playing the role of a corporate saint would protect you? But you forgot about the paperwork, little sister." The temperature within my circulatory system plummeted. The dormant joint account, the vulnerability I had locked inside my fireproof safe was finally detonating. "I still possess those forged wire transfers from 6 years ago," Elena continued, her voice dripping with triumphant malice. "And more importantly, that joint corporate account you co-signed when you were 21 is still completely active. Javier and Rosa deliberately refused to authorize the closure. Your legal name is still permanently attached to the primary routing number we used to funnel the missing revenue. I have already drafted a comprehensive statement for the federal investigators detailing how my brilliant sibling, the senior financial expert, orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme remotely from her secure location in Gulfport." The sheer sociopathic brilliance of her strategy hung heavily in the air, mingling with the scent of fried grease. She had completely weaponized my own professional competence against me. "You work in medical compliance, Miyuki," Elena sneered over the cellular line, articulating each syllable with maximum calculated cruelty. "You investigate fraud for a living. How long do you genuinely think your fancy hospital network will keep you on their payroll when the Internal Revenue Service publicly links your pristine reputation to a $600,000 criminal enterprise? They will terminate your employment before the news segment even finishes broadcasting. I will ensure the authorities drag you back to Texas in handcuffs. Sign the loan documents or you take the fall for everything." The threat was absolute. It was a perfectly designed snare intended to completely annihilate the quiet, verifiable existence I had bled to construct. They were demanding I finance their salvation, utilizing my own legal destruction as the primary collateral. I did not scream. I did not hurl my ceramic mug across the diner. I did not offer a single word of defense or justification to the extortionist threatening my freedom. I allowed 3 agonizingly long seconds of absolute silence to pass, letting the gravity of her blackmail settle firmly into the space between us. Then I reached forward and terminated the active call. The screen plunged into total darkness. I shifted my attention back toward the woman sitting across from me. Rosa was actively holding her breath, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate anticipation, waiting to see if the psychological torture had successfully broken my resistance. I slowly pushed my chair backward, the rubber feet groaning loudly against the linoleum flooring. I stood up to my full height, smoothing an invisible crease from the front of my professional trousers. I reached across the sticky table, bypassing the lukewarm water, and firmly grasped the heavy leather-bound folio containing their catastrophic business ledgers. I tucked the damning evidence securely beneath my left arm. "Leave the diner," I instructed my mother, my voice entirely devoid of anger, fear, or sympathy. "Do not attempt to contact my personal device again. Do not approach my vehicle. Return to your hotel room and wait." I turned my back on the architect of my misery and walked deliberately toward the exit, pushing through the heavy glass doors into the humid coastal night. I did not look back to see if she was weeping. The ghosts had mistakenly assumed they were cornering a frightened, compliant victim. They failed to realize they had just handed their entire financial playbook directly to a senior auditor who specialized in destroying illusions. The storm shelter I had built 6 years ago was finally opening, and I was preparing to drag every single one of them inside. The cardboard box containing my family's financial ruin sat heavily upon the passenger seat of my sedan during the tense drive homeward. It seemed to emit a distinctly toxic radiation, feeling akin to transporting a live explosive device through the damp coastal traffic. Municipal street lamps projected rapid rhythmic slashes of yellow light across the corrugated cardboard flaps as I navigated the rain-slicked avenues toward my heavily secured property. Upon breaching the reinforced threshold of my sanctuary, I carried the damning cargo directly into the kitchen. My retired racing canine lifted his slender snout from the orthopedic mat, observing my rigid posture before sensibly returning to his slumber. I deposited the physical records squarely atop the granite island. Before securing the deadbolts for the night, I retrieved my cellular device and composed a highly specific text message directed to the temporary lodging where my mother currently waited. I require precisely 48 hours to thoroughly evaluate the proposed asset transfer documents I typed. Do not attempt any further communication until Sunday evening. Any unsolicited interference will guarantee my immediate permanent refusal to participate in this rescue operation. I depressed the transmission button, discarded the electronic device onto the nearby sofa, and inhaled a massive volume of oxygen. The suffocating, paralyzing terror that had previously constricted my respiratory system inside the hospital parking structure began to systematically evaporate. I was no longer the frightened, fleeing victim cornered by the architects of her childhood misery. I was officially reverting to my fundamental core nature. I am a professional auditor, and they had foolishly invited me to examine their ledger. However, examining the physical books provided within the cardboard receptacle was entirely insufficient. Tangible paper documents represent a curated narrative meticulously designed to display exactly what the author desires you to perceive. They act as a mathematical disguise. To genuinely comprehend the lethal mechanism Elena had constructed, I desperately required the friction of live, unfiltered data. Friday morning dawned with a pale, anemic sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense marine layer hovering above the Gulf. I brewed an exceptionally strong pot of black tea, energized my secure home workstation, and initiated the riskiest maneuver of my professional career. I needed to digitally infiltrate the Texas logistics firm. My target was a former colleague named Sarah, the chronically exhausted payroll administrator who maintained the back-end administrative portals. During my tenure as a junior clerk, Sarah had perpetually hovered on the brink of a nervous breakdown, constantly battling Javier's tyrannical micromanagement and the suffocating volume of corporate bureaucracy. I understood her psychological profile intimately. She possessed zero loyalty to the executive family, fundamentally relying on the path of least resistance just to survive her daily shifts. I dialed the familiar corporate routing number, navigating the automated directory, until the system transferred my connection to the Human Resources Department. Sarah answered on the fourth ring, her greeting saturated with a profound, unmistakable weariness. I engaged my most authentic, apologetic vocal register. "Hello, Sarah. It is Miyuki Garcia," I stated smoothly. "I am incredibly sorry to disrupt your busy Friday morning." A heavy, stunned pause materialized across the fiber optic connection. Miyuki, the administrator, breathed genuine shock, elevating her pitch. "We heard you moved across the country years ago. Is everything all right?" "I am doing wonderfully," I lied, with effortless precision. "But I am currently encountering a massive bureaucratic nightmare. I am finalizing an extensive background check for a senior hospital promotion out here on the coast, and the municipal investigators are demanding my original W-2 tax forms from 6 years ago. The federal deadline is rapidly approaching this afternoon." I strategically paused, allowing the manufactured urgency to permeate the conversation. "I am terrified to contact Javier directly," I confessed, deliberately injecting a slight, vulnerable tremor into my syllables. "You remember how angry he gets regarding past employee inquiries? I was hoping, just as a massive personal favor, you might grant me temporary restricted access to the legacy employee portal so I can silently download my own tax document without triggering an executive alert." The social engineering functioned flawlessly. By invoking my father's legendary temper, I successfully positioned Sarah and myself as allied survivors of the same hostile regime. I offered her an opportunity to bypass standard protocol without actively exerting any significant effort. Human fatigue consistently remains the absolute weakest vulnerability within any cybersecurity infrastructure. "Let me generate a guest credential link," Sarah sighed, the distinct clacking of her mechanical keyboard transmitting through the speaker. "It will only remain active for 60 minutes, and it is strictly sandboxed to the historical tax directory. Do not navigate outside that specific folder, Miyuki. If the system flags an unauthorized internal breach, Javier will personally terminate my employment." I promised absolute compliance, expressed profound gratitude, and disconnected the line the instant the secure hyperlink arrived within my encrypted email inbox. I clicked the authentication portal, inputted the temporary numerical passcode, and gained entry to the corporate back-end server. I was officially inside the fortress. Numbers are wonderfully honest little creatures. They do not possess the capacity to weep, they cannot attempt emotional extortion, and they never manufacture elaborate deceptions to protect a favored sibling. If you line them up correctly beneath the harsh light of mathematical scrutiny, they will inevitably confess the absolute truth. I downloaded my ancient tax form to maintain the digital alibi, then immediately bypassed the superficial sandbox restrictions. The logistics firm utilized a pathetically outdated enterprise software suite featuring directory permissions I had mapped extensively during my previous employment. Within 4 minutes, I breached the primary operational database. I dragged the cardboard box closer to my monitors and began cross-referencing the physical pages against the raw, undeleted server logs. The scope of the devastation was breathtaking. I was not merely observing the isolated guilt of my older sibling. I was actively pulling the structural thread on the family's incredibly toxic sweater to witness exactly how rapidly the entire garment would unravel. Elena had orchestrated a masterful, devastating symphony of financial ruin. I tracked the fraudulent vendor invoices, tracing the fictitious equipment purchases directly into a network of anonymous shell corporations registered in Nevada. She had systematically bled the transportation fleet dry, diverting hundreds of thousands of dollars into untraceable offshore repositories. But the truly terrifying mechanism, the specific detail that caused my blood to freeze solid within my veins, was not the destination of the stolen capital. It was the designated pipeline. Elena did not utilize her own executive credentials to authorize the massive outbound wire transfers. I stared at the blinking cursor on my left monitor, my breathing completely suspended. The digital metadata attached to every single fraudulent transaction displayed a highly familiar authorization signature. The money had been violently ripped from the company ledgers and funneled directly through the dormant joint corporate account, the exact financial vessel I co-signed when I was 21 years old. My sister had not simply robbed our parents blind. She had weaponized my legal identity to construct the perfect laundering apparatus. On paper, to any external federal investigator examining the raw banking records, the mastermind orchestrating the $600,000 embezzlement ring was undeniably Miyuki Garcia. The extortion threat she delivered yesterday over the cellular device was not a bluff. It was a mathematically verified reality. The Internal Revenue Service was not currently hunting Elena. The government agents were actively preparing to indict me. Suddenly, a massive crimson notification banner materialized across the top of my monitor screen. The enterprise software emitted a sharp digital chime. The system was generating an automated alert not because I had breached the directory, but because a secondary user had just logged into the primary administrative node from an external location. Someone else was actively monitoring the exact same server I was currently auditing. I rapidly initiated a traceroute protocol to identify the incoming connection. The IP address did not originate from the Texas corporate headquarters. It did not ping from my mother's local hotel room. The geographical locator resolved to a specialized cybercrimes division operating out of a federal building situated in downtown Houston. The government auditors were not arriving on Monday morning. They were already inside the system, watching my temporary credential pull the exact ledgers connecting my name to the massive criminal enterprise. The trap had forcefully snapped shut, and I was holding the murder weapon. I terminated the secure network tunnel the exact fraction of a second the federal locator beacon illuminated my secondary monitor. My fingers hammered the mechanical keyboard with practiced speed, executing a rapid sequence of defensive commands. I scrubbed the session cookies, wiped the temporary cache directories, and completely burned the digital bridge connecting my coastal sanctuary to the compromised corporate server in Texas. The government agents were actively prowling the perimeter of the primary database, searching for the source of the massive financial hemorrhage. I had closed the back door just in time to avoid detection, but the profound reality of the situation hung heavily in the suffocating air of my home office. I leaned back into the ergonomic mesh of my chair, my lungs burning as they demanded oxygen. My pulse pounded a frantic rhythm against my eardrums. I was officially holding the murder weapon. The time displayed in the lower right corner of my screen read exactly 3 a.m. on Saturday. The violent coastal thunderstorm that had previously battered my reinforced window shutters had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a heavy, damp stillness. The silence inside my residence felt absolute, interrupted only by the rhythmic, peaceful breathing of my greyhound sleeping on his orthopedic mat in the adjacent hallway. I stared at the dense folders of downloaded data I had successfully extracted before severing the link. I brewed a fresh mug of black tea, though my stomach churned with a severe acidic nausea. I needed to dissect the ledgers offline, away from the prying eyes of the Cybercrimes Division. I opened the primary asset transfer spreadsheet, bathing my exhausted face in the pale blue glow of the monitor. Numbers possess a pristine, unforgiving honesty that human beings entirely lack. They do not possess the capacity to weep, they cannot attempt emotional extortion, and they never manufacture elaborate theatrical deceptions to protect a favored sibling. As I cross-referenced the fraudulent vendor invoices against the outgoing wire transfers, the massive boulder finally dropped from the ceiling and crushed the remaining fragments of my childhood illusions. Javier was undeniably a terrible manager, prone to explosive temper tantrums and gross incompetence, but he was absolutely not the criminal mastermind. The tearful, desperate narrative my mother had forcefully delivered inside that greasy diner was a spectacular fabrication. Rosa had weaponized her own physical deterioration to sell me a lie. She was desperately attempting to cast her golden child as a tragic victim of a tyrannical patriarch. The mathematics proved otherwise. Elena was orchestrating absolutely everything. She was the singular, undisputed architect of the entire financial collapse. The downloaded ledgers revealed a highly sophisticated web of corporate deceit. My older sister had systematically bled the logistics firm dry, but the embezzled operating cash was merely the foundation of her illicit empire. The most devastating files within the directory were not phantom shipping manifests. They were origination contracts for 3 distinct, astronomically expensive commercial bridge loans. Elena had actively leveraged the failing transportation fleet to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in fresh predatory capital. She immediately funneled those newly acquired funds directly into a network of untraceable shell corporations registered in Nevada. However, a solitary vice president cannot unilaterally bind a company to that volume of toxic debt. The commercial lending institutions strictly demanded a secondary executive guarantor to finalize the underwriting process. I opened the concealed subfolder containing the high-resolution scanned documents. I navigated to the final page of the largest loan agreement, and the blood froze entirely within my veins. There, resting securely beside the legitimate, chaotic scrawl of my father, was a flawless replication of my own handwriting. My legal name was signed in a smooth, confident cursive. The perpetrator had utilized my pristine, unblemished financial identity to bypass the stringent credit requirements of the lenders. The puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together, locking into place with a terrifying audible click inside my mind. Elena had deliberately resurrected the dormant joint corporate account, the exact financial vessel I co-signed when I was 21 years old, to serve as the primary receiving mechanism for the fraudulent loans. A visceral memory struck me with sickening clarity. The sterile white walls of my current office faded away, rapidly replaced by the humid atmosphere of my childhood home. I was suddenly 11 years old again, standing silently in the shadow of a hallway doorway. Elena was 17. She sat at her pristine white wicker desk, bathed in the warm yellow glow of a small brass reading lamp. A failing high school chemistry report card lay flat against the wooden surface. If our parents discovered the dismal academic grade, her weekend social privileges would immediately evaporate. I watched her grip a heavy blue ballpoint pen. She did not display a single ounce of nervous anxiety. Her hands did not tremble. She did not sweat or hesitate. She spent 20 minutes methodically practicing our mother's signature on a piece of torn scrap paper. Once her muscles completely memorized the exact loops and angles of the letters, she calmly applied the ink to the official academic document. The resulting forgery was a masterpiece of casual manipulation. She had always been a highly functioning sociopath, equipped with a pen treating moral boundaries as mere suggestions meant only for lesser people. 14 years later, she had deployed that identical, remorseless skill set to commit massive federal fraud. The horrifying truth behind my living funeral finally materialized beneath the harsh glare of my monitors. My parents had not hosted that cruel dining room ceremony merely to disown a troublesome daughter. The profound psychological violence they inflicted upon me was not an emotional overreaction to the initial theft of $45,000. It was a meticulously calculated, strategic financial maneuver. By publicly declaring me dead to the extended family and forcing me out of the state, they guaranteed I would never intercept a stray bank statement delivered by the Postal Service. They geographically isolated me so I would never casually walk into a local branch and inquire about the status of the dormant ledger. They did not banish me out of anger. They intentionally kept my ghost lingering in the peripheral shadows, actively preserving my immaculate credit history strictly to facilitate ongoing massive identity theft. I was already legally implicated in a massive federal felony. The vicious extortion threat Elena had delivered over the cellular network at the diner was never a desperate bluff. It was a brilliant exercise in psychological projection. She boldly threatened to shift the blame for the federal audit onto my shoulders because she had already spent the last 6 years cementing my name to the absolute center of the criminal conspiracy. According to the forged banking documents currently residing on those federal servers in Houston, I was the primary beneficiary of the stolen capital. If the government agents decrypted those specific files, my carefully constructed coastal sanctuary would instantly disintegrate. The hospital administration would terminate my employment the exact moment the criminal indictment surfaced on a background check. Municipal law enforcement would seize my home and my modest savings. I would spend the foreseeable future sitting inside a concrete holding cell, awaiting a federal trial, while Elena walked away completely untouched. Most ordinary individuals would succumb to a catastrophic panic attack upon discovering their impending incarceration. They would weep uncontrollably, shatter their computer monitors in a fit of rage, or frantically dial emergency legal counsel. I experienced none of those typical human reactions. Sitting alone in the quiet darkness of my house, staring directly at my own stolen identity, I felt a freezing, crystalline calm wash over my entire nervous system. It was the specific, tranquil clarity of an auditor who has finally unearthed the smoking gun. The toxic emotional manipulation was completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable mathematics of a battlefield. My sister had severely miscalculated the fundamental nature of her opponent. She assumed the discarded scapegoat would permanently cower and submit when presented with a manufactured catastrophe. She completely forgot that I spend 40 hours every single week systematically destroying financial illusions for a living. I am not a victim. I am the cleanup crew. I possessed the undeniable digital proof of her absolute guilt. But a smoking gun requires live ammunition to successfully function in a court of law. Digital files are notoriously difficult to authenticate quickly when the victim shares a surname with the perpetrator and a joint account legally exists. The federal investigators would freeze my personal assets the instant they processed the loan originations on Monday morning. I had roughly 48 hours to execute a lethal counterstrike, but these downloaded spreadsheets were legally insufficient to clear my name. I desperately needed the physical, notarized banking forms to prove I was entirely absent from the state of Texas on the exact dates those documents were executed. I could not simply request those records from the banking institution without triggering a massive executive alert. I needed to compel the extortionist to voluntarily hand me the authentic paperwork. I pushed my chair away from the desk, realizing the only way to obtain the original documents was to convince Elena that her extortion attempt had actually succeeded. I needed to build a trap perfectly disguised as a total surrender. The ghosts thought they had cornered a frightened child, but they were about to step directly into the crosshairs of a senior compliance officer. The mathematics of embezzlement possess a very specific, undeniable signature. I sat in the pre-dawn darkness of my home office, staring at the cascading rows of stolen capital displayed across my dual monitors. $600,000 is a staggering, monumental sum of liquid currency. When corporate officers siphon that level of funding merely to finance a lavish personal lifestyle, the expenditure inevitably leaves a highly visible, gaudy trail. You typically observe sudden acquisitions of luxury real estate, exotic imported vehicles, and excessive international vacations documented loudly across public social media platforms. I scrutinized my sister's digital footprint using a secondary anonymous browser window. Elena certainly maintained an expensive aesthetic. She favored designer clothing, premium leather handbags, and frequent weekend excursions to high-end day spas in Austin. However, those superficial indulgences did not mathematically equate to a deficit exceeding $500,000. Her vanity projects accounted for perhaps $50,000 over a 6-year period. A massive, gaping void existed within the balance sheet. A discrepancy of that magnitude meant the stolen funds were not being consumed by retail therapy. They were being actively fed to something much larger and significantly more dangerous. I abandoned the public profiles and returned my absolute focus to the raw routing sequences I had successfully extracted from the Texas server. I needed to follow the digital breadcrumbs past their initial destination. The immediate receiving accounts were registered to a cluster of anonymous holding companies headquartered in Nevada. On the surface, these entities appeared to be standard domestic corporate structures, but I am a senior compliance officer. I understand that the initial layer of a laundering operation is intentionally designed to satisfy a casual preliminary inspection. I initiated a deep forensic trace utilizing a specialized investigative software protocol I typically reserve for tracking international pharmaceutical supply chain fraud. I bypassed the superficial incorporation documents and targeted the secondary outgoing wire transfers originating from those Nevada accounts. The domestic facade instantly crumbled beneath the scrutiny. The Nevada corporations were completely hollow. They functioned merely as digital transit terminals, receiving the stolen logistics revenue and immediately bouncing the capital across the border within 24 hours. I tracked the outbound international routing numbers, watching the money flow entirely away from the jurisdiction of the United States. The destination coordinates resolved to a financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. This specific offshore banking sector is globally notorious for providing absolute anonymity and maintaining zero regulatory oversight. I cross-referenced the receiving account identifiers against a global registry of known financial syndicates. The database returned a positive match, and the resulting profile caused the ambient temperature in my office to feel significantly colder. The stolen capital was not sitting idle in a tropical savings account. It was being systematically absorbed by a highly aggressive, unregulated private equity syndicate. These organizations did not function like traditional banking institutions. They were shadow financiers, a ruthless network of global lenders who provided massive high-risk capital injections to desperate clients unable to secure legitimate corporate funding. The puzzle pieces violently shifted, revealing a portrait of profound, catastrophic arrogance. Elena had not simply robbed our parents blind to purchase expensive jewelry. She had attempted to play the role of a visionary corporate titan. At some point during the last 6 years, she had aggressively gambled the entire future of the family transportation fleet on a disastrous, highly speculative offshore investment strategy. Perhaps she tried to corner a specific international shipping route, or maybe she invested heavily in a volatile, unregulated commodities market. The specific nature of the gamble was irrelevant. The undeniable truth was that the market had violently shifted against her. The shadow investment completely collapsed. My sister had lost the gamble, leaving her holding a massive, toxic, and entirely unregulated debt. The relentless, frantic siphoning of the corporate operational accounts suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Elena was not hoarding the cash. She was desperately funneling the stolen revenue offshore merely to satisfy the exorbitant compounding interest payments demanded by her lethal creditors. This horrifying revelation fundamentally altered the entire landscape of the conflict. It completely recontextualized the desperate ambush I had endured in the hospital parking garage days prior. I recalled the specific, visceral details of my mother's physical deterioration. Rosa had displayed severe, uncontrollable tremors. Her eyes were sunken heavily bloodshot, and she carried the distinct sour odor of raw, unadulterated panic. When she grabbed my forearm, her grip possessed the frantic strength of a drowning victim. Rosa was not simply terrified of facing federal tax evasion indictments. The Internal Revenue Service is certainly a formidable adversary, but government agents operate strictly within the rigid confines of the American legal system. They freeze assets, they issue subpoenas, and they occasionally seek custodial sentences in minimum security federal facilities. The Shadow Syndicate operating out of the Caribbean did not utilize subpoenas. They did not respect municipal boundaries or legal jurisdictions. They were the type of unlisted creditors who resolved severely delinquent balances using physical intimidation, violence, and permanent disappearances. The family was actively running from individuals who broke bones instead of filing civil lawsuits. The extortion attempt Elena delivered over the phone was far more depraved than simple identity theft. My family did not merely want to rent my pristine credit score to temporarily shelter their remaining transportation assets. They were deliberately positioning me as the sole legal owner of the fraudulent loans. They were actively building a paper trail that pointed directly away from Texas and squarely toward the Mississippi Gulf Coast. They were setting me up to be the ultimate human shield. If the federal government investigated the fraud, they would find my forged signatures. More importantly, if the lethal offshore syndicate decided to send collection agents to recover their missing $500,000, the shadow creditors would track the digital footprint directly to the individual who officially authorized the capital transfer. They would bypass the true orchestrator in Texas and hunt down Miyuki Garcia in Gulfport. My parents were entirely willing to sacrifice my physical safety and potentially my life to protect their favored child from the violent consequences of her own spectacular arrogance. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the absolute staggering depth of their betrayal. The initial shock of discovering the forgery morphed into something entirely different. The cold, analytical detachment I usually maintained during corporate audits evaporated rapidly, replaced by a dense, suffocating wave of calculating rage. I could not simply abandon my home and run. Attempting to vanish again would only delay the inevitable moment when either a federal marshal or a syndicate enforcer kicked down my front door. Running was the defensive maneuver of a terrified scapegoat, and I had officially resigned from that position 6 years ago. I had to dismantle the entire operation from the inside. To successfully execute that demolition, I desperately required the original, physically notarized banking documents currently held hostage in Texas. Digital screenshots of a compromised server would never hold up in a federal courtroom, nor would they convince a shadow creditor of my innocence. I needed the authentic paperwork proving I was a victim of sustained identity theft. I could not steal the documents. I had to manipulate Elena into voluntarily delivering the murder weapon directly into my hands. To accomplish this impossible task, I had to completely suppress my righteous anger. I had to willingly step back into the agonizing, subservient role my family had assigned me since childhood. I needed to convince the sociopath that her extortion had worked perfectly, that I was thoroughly broken, terrified, and entirely willing to capitulate to her demands. I had to invite the predators inside my heavily fortified refuge. I reached across the desk, picking up my cellular device. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a pale glow across the empty mug of tea. I opened the messaging application and prepared to construct a lie massive enough to save my own life. The trap had to be absolutely flawless, beginning with a profound, unconditional surrender, setting the stage for a reunion they would deeply regret. Grand betrayals do not require theatrical emotional outbursts or shattered glassware. True devastation requires a methodical, meticulously documented response. I did not immediately contact a defense attorney to negotiate a desperate plea deal, nor did I frantically contact a federal prosecutor begging for a preemptive immunity agreement. The American legal system simply does not operate with that kind of cinematic velocity, and I refuse to rely on the subjective mercy of a government lawyer. Instead, I utilize the most powerful, unyielding, and ruthless mechanism available in the corporate universe. I weaponize the federal bureaucracy. At precisely 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I sat at my reinforced home workstation and navigated toward the secure online portal managed by the Internal Revenue Service. The interface was sterile, functional, and devoid of any compassion. I did not experience a single moment of hesitation as my fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. I officially filed a comprehensive identity theft affidavit, legally declaring under penalty of perjury that my identity had been hijacked. I explicitly named my older sister as the primary perpetrator of the fraud. Immediately following that critical submission, I finalized a formal whistleblower claim, attaching preliminary summaries detailing the massive offshore embezzlement ring and the shadow syndicate. I did not possess a magical shield of legal immunity. What I possessed was a highly encrypted 12-digit federal confirmation sequence glowing sharply against my high-definition monitor. That specific string of alphanumeric characters initiated an irreversible, catastrophic countdown clock. The government machinery was now officially activated. Once those investigative gears begin grinding, no amount of weeping bribery or maternal manipulation can possibly unring that particular bell. The avalanche had started. With the lethal bureaucratic trap officially locked into place, I retrieved my cellular device to invite the prey directly into the snare. I dialed the local accommodations where my mother had been frantically pacing for the past 48 hours. Rosa answered the connection on the very first ring, her breath catching audibly in her throat, vibrating with a desperate, suffocating tension. I closed my eyes and consciously manipulated my vocal cords, draining every single ounce of professional auditor confidence from my tone. I needed to sound exactly like the terrified, subservient, easily broken 25-year-old girl they had successfully banished 6 years prior. I deliberately injected a slight trembling hesitation into my breathing pattern. I informed her that I had thoroughly reviewed the corporate ledgers she abandoned at the greasy diner. I told her I was absolutely terrified by the sheer magnitude of the impending commercial foreclosure, perfectly mimicking the panicked, overwhelmed cadence she fully expected to hear. I am willing to authorize the bridge loan transfers, I whispered into the electronic receiver, making certain to let my voice crack slightly on the final syllable of the sentence. You can utilize my pristine credit profile to legally shelter the remaining transportation vehicles until the audit concludes. A sharp, incredibly triumphant gasp transmitted through the tiny speaker. I could practically visualize the matriarch sagging against a hotel wall in profound relief. She fundamentally believed the psychological conditioning had flawlessly held firm. She assumed the discarded scapegoat was returning to her designated position beneath the heavy boots of the family empire. But I immediately attached an uncompromising, rigid condition to my verbal surrender. I claimed I was too frightened of my medical compliance board discovering the financial entanglement. I flatly refused to execute banking documents of this staggering magnitude via digital signature portals or overnight courier services. I demanded that Javier, Rosa, and Elena travel to the Mississippi Gulf Coast together. I insisted they bring the physical original banking contracts containing the required notary stamps and the wet ink signatures. We will execute the asset transfer paperwork together in person. I mandated maintaining the fragile, deceptive facade of a frightened child seeking familial reassurance before taking a massive risk. They eagerly agreed without a single moment of critical hesitation or strategic suspicion. The predators were completely blinded by their own arrogant desperation and their looming shadow creditors falsely assuming I had permanently folded under the immense pressure. They promised to commence the eastward drive immediately. With their physical arrival officially confirmed for Tuesday afternoon, I transitioned instantly from the weeping victim into the clinical executioner. I spent the remainder of Monday evening physically constructing my prosecution file. Digital evidence is remarkably easy to dismiss as corrupted data or malicious hacking by a skilled defense attorney. However, tangible, meticulously organized paperwork carries a devastating psychological weight that absolutely cannot be ignored or waved away. I visited a local corporate supply retailer and purchased a massive 3-inch thick slate gray binder. Returning to the granite island in my kitchen, I began printing every single piece of extracted data I had stolen from the Texas server. The laser printer hummed continuously for 6 uninterrupted hours, spitting out hundreds of pages, emitting the sharp, distinct scent of hot black toner. I collected the forged signature blocks, the fabricated shipping manifests, and the catastrophic offshore routing sequences tracking the stolen capital directly to the Caribbean syndicate. I did not merely stack the paper into a chaotic pile. I engineered a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I utilized bright color-coded tabs to separate the various layers of the conspiracy. Red plastic dividers marked the domestic embezzlement and the forged loan originations. Yellow tabs highlighted the fake vendor invoices used to drain the operating accounts. Blue markers isolated the international wire transfers feeding the unregulated shadow equity firm. I painstakingly indexed every fraudulent transaction, cross-referencing the exact approval dates against my own verifiable employment records in Gulfport, legally proving my physical absence during the precise moments the illicit loans were authorized. Each passing hour, the gray binder grew significantly heavier, expanding into a lethal physical weapon composed entirely of undeniable, mathematically verified facts. I was stacking the stolen numbers like heavy concrete bricks, constructing a flawless, inescapable prison cell, specifically tailored to the exact dimensions of the golden child. The auditor friction was beautifully absolute. The final crucial component of the impending ambush required securing the perfect battlefield. I absolutely could not host this monumental confrontation inside my private residence. My coastal home was a protected sanctuary, and I staunchly refused to let the toxic, desperate machinery of my family contaminate the floors where my retired greyhounds slept peacefully. Furthermore, I required a heavily populated, strictly neutral environment to actively prevent my father from attempting any aggressive physical intimidation or property destruction once the steel trap finally snapped shut on his legacy. I contacted a prominent upscale hotel situated in the bustling commercial center of downtown Gulfport. I bypassed the standard meeting rooms and rented a premium executive conference space for Tuesday afternoon. The location featured a massive, polished mahogany table, heavily soundproofed walls, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the busy coastal thoroughfare below. The environment smelled of expensive floor wax and chilled bottled water. It was an incredibly intimidating, highly visible corporate location that guaranteed a specific behavioral decorum. My parents would never risk initiating a public physical altercation in a luxury setting filled with roaming security personnel and corporate clients. The venue would forcefully compel them to remain seated in their leather chairs while the absolute destruction of their entire universe unfolded across the mahogany wood. By midnight, every single strategic element was perfectly aligned. The federal authorities were already processing the whistleblower intelligence, the extortionists were actively driving east, carrying the original forged documents, and the heavy gray binder sat securely inside my leather briefcase, waiting patiently to detonate. The ghost they had gleefully buried in Texas was fully prepared to host a devastating family reunion, and the resulting collision would permanently balance the ledger. The coastal sunlight cascaded violently through the towering glass atrium of the downtown hotel, painting bright geometric patterns across the polished marble floor. I sat completely motionless inside the lobby cafe, my back rigidly aligned against a leather booth, watching the revolving entrance doors with the clinical detachment of a sniper awaiting a confirmed target. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, the heavy brass mechanisms rotated and my estranged family finally crossed the threshold. They did not merely enter the building. They brought the stifling, oppressive weather system of my traumatic childhood directly into the pristine Mississippi atmosphere. This specific moment represented a massive psychological boulder, a suffocating force designed to crush any remaining rebellion within my spirit. The toxic family dynamic was actively reasserting itself, projecting a heavy gravitational pull meant to drag me back into a permanent state of obedience. I observed their synchronized approach from behind the rim of my porcelain teacup. Javier led the procession, his broad shoulders squared aggressively beneath a tailored charcoal suit. He walked with the arrogant, expansive stride of a conqueror surveying recently acquired territory. My father built his regional transportation logistics empire during the late 90s by systematically bankrupting smaller independent truck drivers. He fundamentally confused ruthless intimidation with genuine business acumen, operating his household with the exact same tyrannical methodology he applied to his loading docks. Today, he was attempting to project an aura of supreme magnanimity. His facial expression suggested he was arriving to bestow a generous inheritance upon an ungrateful subordinate, rather than forcing his youngest daughter to absorb $500,000 in fraudulent federal debt. He believed he was granting me the ultimate privilege of sacrificing my life to save his legacy. Directly behind him glided Rosa. The miraculous medical recovery she exhibited was nothing short of breathtaking. During our previous encounter inside the damp hospital parking structure, she had been a shaking, weeping portrait of absolute devastation. Today, her tears were magically dried up, completely replaced by a radiant, relieved glow. She wore a vibrant turquoise dress and freshly styled hair. My mother had spent her entire adult existence weaponizing fragility. Whenever financial reality or marital conflict threatened to disrupt her comfortable domestic fantasy, she would suddenly develop severe migraines or mysterious nervous conditions retreating beneath her expensive bedsheets while demanding the rest of the universe solve her problems. Her engineered helplessness fueled Javier and his massive ego, creating a symbiotic loop of toxic dependency. Because I had seemingly capitulated to the extortion her manufactured illness was no longer required. She was utterly delighted by my impending ruin. Trailing slightly behind our parents, projecting the smug confidence of an apex predator, was Elena. She wore a sharply tailored crimson blazer that perfectly matched the sole of her expensive Italian footwear. Tucked securely beneath her left arm rested a thick, genuine leather portfolio. I recognized the distinct shape of the object immediately. That specific folder contained the authentic, physically notarized commercial loan assumptions. It held the wet ink signatures, the banking seals, and the absolute proof of her massive offshore embezzlement. Elena had been the undisputed golden child since the day she was born. She possessed a terrifying innate ability to commit grievous transgressions while remaining entirely insulated from the resulting consequences. If she shattered a priceless antique vase during her adolescence, I was the one sent to my bedroom without supper for failing to supervise her properly. She learned very early that her sociopathic tendencies would always be subsidized by someone else experiencing the punishment. They spotted me sitting in the corner booth and navigated toward my table, completely disrupting the quiet, sophisticated ambiance of the cafe. Javier did not offer a greeting. He simply collapsed his heavy frame into the chair opposite mine, signaling the waitress for black coffee using a dismissive wave of his hand. Rosa slid into the booth beside him, beaming a nauseatingly sweet smile in my direction, playing the role of a forgiving matriarch, welcoming a lost sheep back into the fold. Elena remained standing for an extra heartbeat, maximizing her dominant physical elevation before finally sitting. She unzipped the leather portfolio and extracted a dense stack of high-quality paper, placing the documents directly onto the center of the small circular table. "We brought the necessary paperwork," Javier announced, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. His instructions were clear. He wanted a rapid, entirely quiet capitulation executed right here in this highly populated public space. This was a classic, heavily calculated negotiation tactic. By forcing the confrontation into the middle of a crowded restaurant filled with affluent tourists and business executives, they virtually guaranteed I would not create a dramatic scene. They were weaponizing societal etiquette against me. They demanded I sign away my personal freedom, my financial future, and my physical safety in exchange for the fleeting, hollow illusion of their temporary approval. The air surrounding our table suddenly became incredibly suffocating, thick and heavy, with 12 years of completely unchecked, arrogant entitlement. The sheer audacity of their plan caused a brief spike of adrenaline to flood my nervous system. Elena retrieved a heavy silver fountain pen from her designer handbag and pushed it smoothly across the smooth wooden surface. The expensive writing instrument stopped exactly 1 inch from my right hand. "Just sign the designated lines marked with yellow adhesive flags," Elena instructed, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "We can finalize the transfer, return to Texas, and pretend this unfortunate misunderstanding never occurred." A new, extremely dangerous microconflict immediately materialized. If I touched that pen person, if I allowed them to control the physical environment, my entire, carefully constructed ambush would prematurely disintegrate. I absolutely could not execute my strategy while a waitress hovered nearby, refilling water glasses. Furthermore, I needed absolute possession of those original documents before detonating the explosive evidence I had gathered. I had to pivot the negotiation, seize control of the geography, and move the predators into my designated cage without triggering their suspicion. I ignored the silver pen. I slowly laced my fingers together, resting my hands evenly upon my lap. I maintained a perfectly flat, subservient facial expression, ensuring my eyes projected a convincing mixture of fear and exhaustion. "I cannot legally authorize these specific corporate assumptions in a public restaurant," I murmured, keeping my vocal volume intentionally low, forcing Javier to lean forward slightly to hear my words. "The banking compliance regulations explicitly mandate that a transaction exceeding $500,000 requires absolute privacy, a controlled environment, and the presence of an independent certified notary public." Javier frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in immediate annoyance. He despised bureaucratic delays, especially when he believed the victory was already secured. He opened his mouth to argue, prepared to forcefully demand immediate compliance, regardless of the federal regulations. "If we execute these documents improperly, the offshore creditors will reject the transfer," I added quickly, intentionally utilizing the specific terminology that terrified them the most. I watched the blood rapidly drain from Rosa and her freshly powdered cheeks. The mere mention of the Shadow Syndicate instantly destroyed her radiant confidence. "I will not risk voiding the agreement over a technicality. I have already secured a private facility located just down the corridor." Elena studied my face, searching for any microscopic trace of deception. Her sociopathic radar was highly attuned to manipulation, but she was currently blinded by her own overwhelming arrogance. She genuinely believed she had thoroughly broken my spirit. She assumed my insistence on procedural accuracy was simply the pathetic, lingering habit of an obsessive hospital auditor trying to follow the rules while walking toward the execution chamber. She nodded once, signaling her approval to our father. "Fine," Javier grumbled, pushing his chair away from the table with a loud scrape against the marble tile. "Show us the room. Let us finish this miserable business." I stood up, turning my back to my family for the first time in 6 years. I did not check to see if they were following. I knew the heavy gravitational pull of their desperation would compel them to walk directly behind me. I navigated past the bubbling decorative fountain, guiding them away from the open atrium and deep into the quiet, heavily carpeted administrative wing of the hotel. The ambient noise of the lobby gradually faded away, replaced by the hushed, sterile silence of corporate commerce. I stopped in front of the heavy mahogany doors securing the executive conference space. I pushed the brass handles downward, ushering my parents and my sister into the expansive, soundproofed room. The space was beautifully intimidating, featuring an enormous polished table surrounded by genuine leather chairs. A massive wall of reinforced glass overlooked the busy coastal highway, bathing the entire room in harsh, unforgiving natural light. Javier immediately claimed the large chair at the head of the table, attempting to establish dominance over the territory. Rosa sat closely beside him, her previous anxiety returning in small, visible tremors. Elena sauntered into the room, tossing the leather portfolio onto the center of the mahogany wood with a loud, dismissive slap. She took a seat directly across from me, crossing her legs and waiting for my final surrender. I stepped fully inside the room. I reached behind me, gripping the heavy brass handles. I pulled the dual doors completely shut, ensuring the metal latch engaged with a loud, definitive click. The sound echoed sharply off the glass walls. They took their comfortable seats, leaning back into the expensive leather, completely unaware they were no longer the apex predators. They believed they had successfully cornered a frightened, submissive ghost. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that they had just voluntarily locked themselves inside a soundproof vault with a senior forensic auditor who was holding a loaded prosecution file. I took my designated seat across the expansive mahogany surface. The acoustic dampening materials lining the conference room walls absorbed the ambient noise of the bustling Mississippi highway outside, creating a vacuum of absolute silence. I placed my black leather briefcase gently onto the carpeted floor beside my chair. Reaching into the main compartment, I extracted a standard yellow legal pad and positioned it squarely in front of my chest. Concealed directly beneath the stiff cardboard backing of the notepad was my cellular device. Before escorting my family down the corridor, I had discreetly activated the high-definition voice memo application. The digital microphone was already active, silently recording every breath, every rustling piece of paper, and every impending admission of guilt. Elena did not waste a single moment. She leaned forward, pushing the thick stack of fraudulent commercial loan assumptions across the polished wood. The heavy parchment slid into my immediate field of vision. I stared down at the documents, analyzing the intricate details with the trained eye of a forensic auditor. These were not photocopies or digital reproductions. I recognized the authentic blue ink of the notary stamps and the distinct physical indentations where the ballpoint pen had pressed heavily into the paper. This was the original murder weapon. My older sister had personally transported the absolute proof of her federal crimes across state lines and delivered it directly into my physical possession. A fresh wave of adrenaline coursed through my circulatory system, but I maintained a mask of total, subservient defeat. Javier drummed his thick fingers against the tabletop, his patience rapidly evaporating. My father possessed a historically documented inability to tolerate hesitation from his subordinates. During my adolescence, whenever I paused to consider a command, he would perceive the delay as a direct challenge to his absolute authority. Today was no different. He glared at me from the head of the table, his broad chest expanding as he prepared to issue a verbal reprimand. "Just sign the bottom of the final 3 pages, Javier commanded, his tone sharp and uncompromising. "We have a remarkably long drive back to Texas, and I refuse to waste another hour lingering in this humid coastal city." Rosa nodded emphatically beside him, her turquoise dress rustling against the leather chair. She folded her hands together, radiating the toxic, weaponized fragility she always utilized to manipulate the surrounding environment. "Please, Miyuki," she whispered, injecting a sickening amount of manufactured maternal warmth into her vocal cords. "Do the right thing for our legacy. Protect your flesh and blood." I reached out and picked up the heavy silver fountain pen Elena had provided earlier. The metal felt ice cold against my fingertips. I removed the cap, hovering the polished nib directly over the designated signature line flagged with a bright yellow adhesive marker. I deliberately froze my posture. I allowed them to taste the absolute certainty of their victory for exactly 10 seconds. I watched their micro-expressions shift during that calculated pause. Javier relaxed his aggressive shoulders, leaning back into his seat with a satisfied exhale. Rosa offered a small, triumphant smile, believing her emotional extortion had flawlessly succeeded. Elena crossed her arms, her crimson blazer shifting as she basked in the supreme glory of her own sociopathic brilliance. They genuinely thought they had won. They believed the ghost they had buried 6 years ago was finally submitting to her designated fate as the eternal scapegoat. Then I slowly lowered my hand. I set the silver pen down on the table, placing it parallel to the unblemished documents. The sudden sound of the metal casing striking the solid wood echoed loudly inside the soundproof room. The collective atmosphere instantly shattered. Javier snapped into a rigid, upright position, his dark eyes narrowing in dangerous confusion. Rosa gasped sharply, clutching her chest as if she were experiencing a sudden cardiac event. Elena uncrossed her arms, her smug demeanor rapidly transforming into furious indignation. "Why should I take this monumental debt, Elena?" I asked. I kept my vocal delivery incredibly soft, forcing the microphone hidden beneath my notepad to capture the absolute clarity of my interrogation. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with my sister, ensuring she felt the full weight of the confrontation. You took the operational funds 6 years ago. You actively resurrected the dormant joint banking ledger without my legal consent. You systematically funneled the stolen logistics capital directly into a Caribbean shadow equity syndicate. Why is this catastrophic financial failure suddenly my responsibility? My older sibling stared at me, completely blinded by her own monumental arrogance. She had spent her entire existence shielded from the consequences of her actions. Whenever she failed an academic course, caused a vehicular collision, or destroyed a personal relationship, our parents immediately rushed to sanitize the wreckage. She was groomed to be the beautiful, untouchable face of the Garcia Empire, while I was systematically molded into the invisible structural foundation meant to silently absorb her collateral damage. Because she assumed I was utterly cornered by her aggressive offshore blackmail, she did not sense the trap. She felt entirely invincible. Elena rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, condescending laugh. She leaned across the table and gave me the ultimate, devastating gift of total honesty. "Because you are the strong one, Mayuki," she scoffed, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. "It is your fundamental job to absorb the impact. I am the public face of this business. You are the cleanup crew. That is exactly how this family works. You owe me this protection." I shifted my gaze toward the head of the table. "And you both agree with this arrangement?" I questioned, projecting a tone of wounded disbelief to encourage further validation. "You believe threatening me with a federal indictment is an acceptable method to cover her gambling losses." Javier nodded in solemn, resolute agreement. He did not possess an ounce of remorse. "Your sister is vital to the ongoing operation of the transportation fleet," he declared, his deep voice cementing his complicity in the conspiracy. "You ran away to the coast and abandoned your obligations. You owe us this sacrifice. This is your duty to the bloodline." Rosa chimed in immediately, verifying her active participation in the psychological warfare. "We had to push you hard, sweetheart," she admitted, completely abandoning her previous facade of fragile innocence. "You are so incredibly stubborn. We needed to make you understand the severe gravity of the situation. The foreign creditors will kill us if we do not provide a clean asset transfer." They had just systematically confessed to grand larceny, identity theft, and organized extortion. Furthermore, they openly confirmed the existence of the lethal offshore syndicate, firmly establishing the undeniable motive behind the massive financial fraud. I reached underneath the yellow cardboard backing of my legal pad. My thumb located the glowing digital interface of my smartphone screen. I pressed the red square icon, instantly terminating the active voice recording. The application saved the audio file with a microscopic electronic click. The trap had officially snapped shut. I slowly pulled my mobile device out from its hiding place, placing the illuminated screen face up on the mahogany table for everyone to witness. The digital audio waveform remained visible, serving as an undeniable testament to their catastrophic tactical error. The temperature inside the room plummeted to an absolute zero. The triumphant arrogance previously radiating from my relatives violently evaporated, replaced instantly by a horrifying, suffocating realization. But a recorded confession alone would not neutralize the imminent threat of physical violence from the Caribbean syndicate. Before Javier could process the deception and lunge across the table to physically seize my phone, I calmly reached down and retrieved my leather briefcase. The true audit was about to begin, and the ghosts of my past were entirely unprepared for the sheer velocity of the incoming avalanche. I placed the massive 3-inch thick gray binder onto the wood, a physical monument to their destruction, and prepared to introduce them to the United States federal government. I pushed the thick stack of fraudulent commercial loan assumptions back across the polished mahogany surface. The heavy parchment slid smoothly over the expensive wood, coming to a complete stop exactly 2 inches from my older sibling and her crimson blazer. I did not break eye contact with her while executing this deliberate motion. The silence in the soundproof executive space suddenly became incredibly dense, pressing against the eardrums of everyone present. Javier inhaled sharply, his broad chest expanding as he prepared to unleash a torrent of patriarchal rage. He perceived my refusal as a direct challenge to his absolute authority, entirely accustomed to intimidating regional transport drivers into submission through sheer vocal volume. Before he could articulate a single syllable of his impending reprimand, I reached down toward the carpeted floor beside my leather chair. my fingers wrapped firmly around the fixed spine of the massive slate gray binder I had compiled the previous night. I hoisted the 3-inch compilation of forensic evidence upward, lifting it above the edge of the conference table. I released my grip, allowing gravity to pull the massive object downward. It struck the immaculate wooden surface with a devastating heavy thud. The concussive sound reverberated violently off the reinforced glass windows, instantly silencing any vocal objections my father had planned to issue. The physical weight of the evidence was undeniably imposing. I flipped the durable plastic cover open, exposing the meticulously organized interior. Brightly colored index tabs protruded from the sides, each one representing a different layer of their catastrophic corporate demise. "I am not here to assume your toxic liabilities," I stated calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "I am here to walk you through my actual agenda." I turned to the first section designated by a bright red divider. I extracted a series of densely printed spreadsheets, sliding them toward the center of the table so they were plainly visible to all 3 of my adversaries. "These are the detailed Internet protocol logs extracted directly from your compromised corporate servers in Houston," I explained. I watched Elena lean forward instinctively, her sociopathic confidence fracturing slightly as her eyes scanned the intricate numerical data. When we were younger, she always mocked my intense dedication to computer science, preferring to spend her afternoons cultivating social capital at country club swimming pools, while I learned how to dismantle encrypted networks. She completely failed to realize that those solitary hours granted me the exact skills required to execute her current destruction. These specific digital routing markers prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the original embezzlement originated from your personal administrative terminal. I continued, my gaze fixed firmly upon her suddenly rigid posture. "You bypassed the standard security protocols using your executive credentials, siphoning the operational revenue long before you ever decided to resurrect my dormant joint ledger." Elena attempted a scoff, though the sound emerged brittle and distinctly lacking its previous venomous edge. "Digital footprints can be easily manipulated by any competent hacker," she countered defensively, desperately trying to maintain her crumbling facade. "A skilled defense attorney will tear those printouts apart during a preliminary hearing. You have absolutely nothing substantial." Her predictable denial smoothly introduced the next phase of my carefully orchestrated demolition. I turned the page to the yellow indexed section. I retrieved the high-resolution forensic analysis I had conducted regarding the offshore wire transfers. I placed these specific documents directly on top of the server logs. "Perhaps a lawyer could argue about network access," I conceded smoothly, completely unbothered by her desperate rebuttal. "However, they cannot argue with biometric reality." I pointed toward the magnified images of the authorized signatures used to approve the massive international capital injections into the Caribbean Shadow Equity Syndicate. "I hired an independent, federally certified handwriting expert early this morning," I lied seamlessly, utilizing the exact type of confident deception my family had weaponized against me for decades. "The resulting report confirms that the pen pressure, the loop angles, and the stroke velocity present on these specific authorizations do not match my biological motor functions." Furthermore, I slid a stamped hospital employment ledger next to the signature analysis. "These municipal time cards mathematically prove I was actively participating in a localized compliance audit on the Mississippi Gulf Coast during the precise hours those offshore transfers were executed in Texas. It is physically impossible for me to be the responsible party." Rosa began to hyperventilate. The vibrant turquoise dress she wore suddenly seemed entirely too large for her shrinking frame. Her carefully constructed maternal illusion evaporated completely, leaving behind a terrified, cornered accomplice. She looked frantically between the mountainous pile of incriminating paperwork and the stoic, unyielding expression on my face. Javier remained frozen, his heavy jaw hanging slightly slack. The supreme commander of the logistics empire was currently malfunctioning, entirely incapable of processing the sheer velocity of his own defeat. A new, infinitely more dangerous conflict immediately materialized. If they realized I was merely presenting evidence, they might still attempt to physically overpower me, destroy the binder, and flee the premises. I needed to ensure they understood that the trap was not simply closing, it had already locked permanently. I reached into the final section of the slate folder designated by a stark white tab. I withdrew 2 crisp, single-page documents bearing the official seals of the United States government. I placed them gently upon the mahogany, treating them with the reverence reserved for lethal weapons. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I filed a formal identity theft affidavit with the federal authorities, I announced, watching the last remaining traces of color drain completely from my sister's face. Alongside that declaration, I successfully submitted a comprehensive whistleblower claim directly to the Internal Revenue Service, detailing the entire unregulated private equity gambling scheme. The American federal machine is a remarkably terrifying entity once it is properly activated. It operates with a cold, relentless logic that completely ignores social status, family lineage, or emotional manipulation. The moment those alphanumeric confirmation codes generated on my secure monitor an irreversible countdown sequence commenced. "The federal clock is officially ticking," I whispered, ensuring the absolute gravity of the situation penetrated their thick skulls. As we sit inside this beautiful executive space, heavily armed government agents are already freezing every single corporate asset tied to your logistics firm. They are currently impounding your remaining transportation vehicles, seizing your personal banking ledgers, and securing warrants for your immediate arrest. Javier slammed his massive fists onto the table. The sudden impact rattled the porcelain teacups left behind by the catering staff. "You vindictive, ungrateful wretch!" he bellowed, his vocal cords straining under the immense pressure of his evaporating empire. He began to stand up, his broad shoulders bunching aggressively as the instinct for physical violence overrode his paralyzed cognitive functions. "I will rip that phone apart and burn every single page in this room." He was attempting to rely on the only strategy he truly understood, brute force. But I had anticipated this exact primitive reaction. "You can certainly smash the cellular device into 1,000 plastic pieces," I offered generously, remaining perfectly seated and entirely relaxed. "But it will not save you. The audio recording capturing your collective confessions synced automatically to an encrypted cloud server the exact millisecond I terminated the capture application. My personal retained counsel currently possesses absolute administrative access to those files. If I fail to exit this hotel lobby within the next 15 minutes, he is instructed to forward the raw audio directly to the regional prosecuting director." The smugness that had defined my sister for her entire existence vanished, entirely replaced by a chalky, terror-stricken white mask of absolute defeat. She slumped backward into her expensive leather chair, the crimson blazer suddenly appearing like a bright, highly visible target. Javier froze midway through his aggressive lunge, his heavy arms suspended uselessly in the conditioned air. He slowly lowered himself back down, his authoritative posture collapsing like a demolished skyscraper. Rosa openly wept, abandoning any attempt at graceful composure, burying her face into her trembling hands. The entire grand illusion of their supreme power shattered completely in less than 60 seconds. The crushing weight of documented daylight had systematically eradicated 12 years of unchecked psychological abuse. I had successfully dismantled their fraudulent empire using nothing but mathematics, patience, and the brutal efficiency of bureaucratic law. However, the ultimate surprise was yet to be delivered. The true horror of their situation was not the impending federal incarceration. Incarceration at least offered the guaranteed safety of concrete walls and protective federal custody. I watched Elena stare blankly at the carpeted floor, and I realized she had completely missed the most critical, life-threatening consequence of my morning activities. If the government authorities had officially frozen the corporate accounts 3 hours ago, that meant the massive logistical network possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. And if they possessed zero liquid capital, the enormous extortion payment they were desperately attempting to wire to the Caribbean Shadow Syndicate this very afternoon would inevitably fail to process. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the smooth wood, preparing to deliver the final, devastating revelation that would leave them actively begging for the police to arrive first. The suffocating silence holding the executive meeting suite hostage finally ruptured. The catastrophic fallout initiated not with a quiet whimper, but through an explosive, seismic detonation of patriarchal fury. Javier bolted upright, kicking his heavy leather chair backward with such immense force that the expensive furniture slammed violently against the reinforced glass wall. A deep, mottled purple hue rapidly climbed his thick neck, completely flooding his harsh features. The arteries pulsating near his temples threatened to burst under the astronomical blood pressure. He leaned his massive upper torso across the polished hardwood, projecting a looming predatory silhouette. He bellowed with a deafening volume that tested the absolute limits of the acoustic dampening panels. He roared that I was deliberately destroying the Garcia legacy. He vociferated that my actions were annihilating the sacred family name. The supreme irony of his chosen vocabulary was profoundly staggering. 12 years prior, standing inside the foyer of our Texas residence, he had weaponized those exact syllables to justify my permanent exile. He had banished a teenager into the freezing night, claiming my minor adolescent rebellion was an unforgivable stain upon his honorable reputation. Now, staring at a mountain of federal evidence proving his favored offspring had committed massive corporate treason, he attempted to resurrect that tired, manipulative script. He fundamentally misunderstood the current power dynamic. I was no longer a frightened high school student susceptible to vocal intimidation. The booming baritone that once terrorized dock workers and junior accountants merely sounded like the pathetic, hollow rattle of a dying empire. While our sire desperately tried to reassert dominance through sheer auditory violence, my older sibling chose a drastically different, significantly more chaotic tactical approach. Elena completely abandoned her sophisticated sociopathic veneer. The pristine crimson blazer she wore wrinkled sharply as she launched her entire body forward. She lunged across the expansive desk, her manicured fingernails transforming into desperate claws. She blindly grabbed at the slate-gray compilation resting near my hands, violently attempting to snatch the physical prosecution file away from my possession. During our shared youth, whenever Elena felt truly cornered by her own malicious behavior, she consistently resorted to physical destruction. If she lost a board game, she would flip the cardboard playing surface into the burning fireplace. If an outfit did not fit perfectly, she would take a pair of fabric shears to the expensive material. She was reverting to her most primitive defense mechanism. Her frantic fingers clamped down onto a random cluster of printed pages protruding from the yellow index section. She yanked backward with savage intensity, tearing a meaningless duplicate copy of a fabricated shipping invoice directly in half. The sharp, crisp sound of ripping parchment echoed sharply beneath the bright fluorescent lighting. I did not flinch. I did not blink retreat or raise my arms in a defensive posture. I sat perfectly still, observing her frantic, feral panic with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching an insect struggle inside a sealed glass jar. She clutched the shredded pieces of useless paper against her heaving chest, gasping frantically for oxygen. I calmly reminded the frantic woman that actively destroying a copied spreadsheet inside a Mississippi hotel room would absolutely not halt the momentum of the United States justice system. I informed her that an elite team of specialized government prosecutors was currently reviewing the digitally extracted originals inside a secure regional headquarters in Houston. Her frantic vandalism was entirely futile. She was effectively trying to extinguish a raging forest fire utilizing a single drop of bottled water. The absolute futility of their situation finally penetrated their collective consciousness. The aggressive, combative energy instantly evaporated, entirely drained from the climate-controlled atmosphere. Javier deflated his purple complexion, fading into a sickly, ashen gray tone. He collapsed back into his recovered seat, staring blankly at his trembling hands. Elena dropped the torn invoice, retreating slowly until her spine hit the backrest of her chair, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. The most devastating reaction belonged to the matriarch. Rosa did not simply sit down. She physically crumpled. Her knees gave out completely, sending her tumbling from her chair directly onto the premium corporate carpeting. She landed heavily near the metal leg of the conference table. The meticulously crafted illusion of her fragile, delicate innocence shattered into a million irreparable fragments. She began to weep, but this was absolutely nothing like the manipulative, delicate tears she utilized to control her husband. This was a raw, guttural, animalistic sobbing. The sound was hideous and completely unrestrained, vibrating with profound, soul-crushing despair. She was a mother actively watching her golden child's brilliant future permanently evaporate, replaced by the grim, inescapable reality of a lengthy sentence inside a federal penitentiary. Their stolen money was permanently frozen. Their lavish lifestyle was thoroughly eradicated. Their personal freedom was severely, irrevocably compromised. The Shadow Syndicate would not receive their expected extortion payment, and the government agents were already drafting the arrest warrants. They were caught in an inescapable vice, squeezed relentlessly between ruthless offshore criminals and uncompromising domestic law enforcement. I observed the catastrophic wreckage of my bloodline without a single ounce of pity. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. I reached down toward my open briefcase resting near my feet. I bypassed the remaining legal pads and spare writing instruments, my fingers seeking a very specific item I had packed earlier that morning. I withdrew a heavy-duty, industrial-grade black plastic garbage bag. It was flawlessly folded into a tight, neat square. 12 years ago, when Javier and Rosa expelled me from their pristine home, they refused to let me pack my belongings into proper canvas luggage. They handed me an identical dark sack, loudly declaring that a disgraceful daughter deserved nothing more than a trash receptacle for her departure. It was the ultimate enduring symbol of my traumatic devaluation. Now the metaphorical firearm introduced in the first act of my life was finally being discharged. I shook the folded plastic once, snapping it open with a sharp, definitive crack that sliced through my mother's wailing. The dark material expanded, forming a hollow, echoing cavern. I stood up, smoothing the front of my professional trousers. Reaching across the polished desk, I utilized the edge of my hand to systematically sweep every single piece of their shredded, utterly useless asset transfer documentation directly into the yawning mouth of the dark sack. The torn invoices, the forged loan assumptions, and their pathetic hopes of utilizing my pristine identity all tumbled downward into the void. Once the hardwood surface was completely cleared of their toxic debris, I gathered the top edges of the bag. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, stopping directly beside the weeping matriarch on the floor. I placed the swollen sack gently onto the carpet, positioning it exactly in front of Rosa. "Here is your legacy," I stated softly, closing the chapter on my victimhood. I turned toward the heavy brass door handles, fully prepared to exit the building and leave them to the federal authorities. However, as my fingers grazed the cool metal, my cellular device buzzed sharply within my tailored pocket. I retrieved the phone, glancing down at the illuminated screen. A heavily encrypted text message had just arrived from an unregistered international routing number. The brief, chilling sentence indicated that the Caribbean Syndicate had already bypassed the frozen Texas accounts and tracked the original fraud directly to this exact geographic location. The government agents were coming, but the lethal shadow creditors had arrived first, bringing an entirely new level of terrifying violence to the coastal city. The illuminated screen of my cellular device projected a harsh, sterile glow across the polished mahogany table. The encrypted text message from the unregistered international routing number contained a singular, chilling sentence. The Caribbean Shadow Syndicate had successfully tracked the original fraudulent digital footprint directly to this specific coastal coordinate. My heart initiated a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The unregulated offshore creditors were no longer a distant theoretical concept confined to financial spreadsheets. They had deployed physical enforcers, and those individuals were currently navigating the downtown district of Gulfport, seeking immediate restitution for their missing $500,000. For one fleeting fraction of a second, genuine terror threatened to compromise my crystalline composure. I had meticulously engineered a flawless bureaucratic snare, but government paperwork cannot stop a bullet fired by a desperate cartel collector. However, my anxiety evaporated almost instantly as a new auditory element penetrated the heavy soundproof walls of the executive meeting space. A piercing, synchronized wail of emergency sirens erupted from the busy highway below. I turned my head toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. A vast fleet of dark, heavily armored tactical vehicles aggressively swarmed the hotel courtyard. The United States federal authorities had not merely processed my whistleblower claim. They had mobilized an overwhelming, localized task force. Heavily armed marshals, clad in protective tactical gear, poured out of the black transport van, securing the perimeter with ruthless military precision. The Caribbean enforcers might be exceptionally dangerous within the shadowed corners of the criminal underworld, but they operate strictly through anonymity and fear. They would never dare engage in active, highly coordinated raid conducted by dozens of armed American government agents. The looming threat of international violence dissolved instantly into the humid Mississippi atmosphere, entirely neutralized by the absolute unstoppable reality of bureaucratic justice. The cavalry had indeed arrived, but they were not here to rescue the Garcia family. They were arriving to permanently dismantle them. Down on the premium corporate carpeting, Rosa remained completely oblivious to the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the exterior glass. Her entire universe had shrunk to the terrifying dimensions of her impending incarceration. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, dragging the vibrant turquoise fabric of her expensive dress across the floor. She reached upward, launching her trembling arms toward my seated posture. Her manicured fingers clamped down around my wrists with astonishing bruising strength. The skin of her palms felt incredibly cold and clammy, slick with the sweat of unadulterated panic. The cloying scent of her premium floral perfume mixed sickeningly with the sour, undeniable odor of raw maternal desperation. She stared up at me, her heavily mascaraed eyes wide and bloodshot, leaking a continuous stream of ruined makeup down her previously pristine cheeks. "Miyuki, please," she begged, her vocal cords straining and cracking under the immense weight of her absolute ruin. "You are our daughter. Withdraw the files. Save us." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman kneeling beside my leather chair. I felt absolutely nothing. No lingering affection, no residual childhood obligation, and certainly no manufactured guilt. I stared directly into the eyes of the matriarch who had methodically stripped every single photograph of my face from the walls of her Texas home. I remembered the vast empty spaces left behind on the floral wallpaper, scrubbed entirely clean as if I had never drawn breath inside that household. I remembered the vicious, calculated cruelty of my own living funeral, a theatrical masterpiece designed solely to isolate me so they could freely cannibalize my pristine identity. This specific interaction represented the ultimate, undeniable payoff. This was the exact moment the cosmic ledger finally balanced to an absolute permanent zero. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to yank my arms away forcefully. I moved with slow, deliberate, mechanical precision. I lowered my hands, gently prying her frantic, gripping fingers away from my skin, one by one. I detached her completely from my physical person and pushed my chair backward. I stood up tall, straightening the lapels of my professional jacket, establishing a towering vertical dominance over the shattered wreckage of my bloodline. "You held my funeral 6 years ago, Mom," I stated softly, ensuring the microphone of the universe captured the finality of my declaration. "And you were right. That daughter is dead, and ghosts don't sign checks." Rosa collapsed entirely onto her side, burying her face into the woven fibers of the carpet, emitting a hollow, devastated wail that sounded barely human. Javier remained completely paralyzed at the head of the long table, staring blankly at the black garbage bag filled with his shredded legacy. Elena sat frozen in her seat, her sociopathic arrogance permanently extinguished, her skin resembling the pale color of chalk dust. I reached down and gripped the sturdy leather handle of my briefcase. I turned my back on the catastrophic debris of my former relatives and walked purposefully toward the heavy brass doors. I depressed the metal latch, stepping out of the suffocating conference room and into the brightly illuminated corridor. I navigated the busy lobby smoothly, bypassing the swarm of federal agents rushing inward to execute their arrest warrants. I pushed through the revolving glass entrance and stepped outside into the magnificent, blinding Mississippi sunlight. I inhaled a massive breath of salty coastal air, tasting the sweet, intoxicating flavor of absolute freedom. 6 months later, the dust generated by the explosive federal collision finally settled. The Internal Revenue Service Whistleblower Office operated with a brutal, uncompromising efficiency. Their elite forensic accounting teams spent weeks dissecting the massive gray binder I had provided. They successfully mapped every single fraudulent wire transfer, exposed the forged signatures, and traced the illicit capital directly to the Cayman Island accounts. Armed with this undeniable mathematical proof, the federal government initiated a massive civil asset forfeiture protocol. The Justice Department swooped down upon the Texas logistics firm and liquidated absolutely everything. They seized the massive shipping warehouses, auctioned the entire fleet of commercial transportation vehicles, and drained the remaining corporate ledgers. They executed this comprehensive financial strike mere fractions of a second before the lethal offshore creditors could finalize their own hostile shadow takeover. The Caribbean syndicate arrived to collect their delinquent extortion payments, only to discover a completely hollowed-out shell guarded by heavily armed federal marshals. The dangerous underground lenders were left holding massive, unenforceable debts, completely outmaneuvered by the American bureaucratic machine. Javier, Rosa, and Elena were systematically processed through the federal penal system, facing a monumental cascade of felony indictments, ranging from aggravated identity theft to international wire fraud. Their opulent lifestyle evaporated overnight, replaced by the grim, highly regimented reality of minimum security custodial facilities. They attempted to secure elite legal representation, but their frozen bank accounts prevented any high-powered defense attorneys from accepting their catastrophic case. Meanwhile, my own circumstances evolved in a vastly different, exceptionally prosperous direction. The government whistleblower program functions utilizing a very specific, highly lucrative incentive structure. Citizens who successfully expose massive financial corruption and facilitate the recovery of stolen tax revenue are legally entitled to a substantial bounty. Because my meticulously organized prosecution file directly enabled the Justice Department to seize hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit assets, the administrative court awarded me a maximum percentage of the recovered funds. A thick, heavily bonded envelope arrived inside my residential mailbox on a crisp Tuesday morning. Inside that secure packaging rested a certified federal treasury check bearing a staggering numerical figure. It was a sum of legitimate, perfectly clean capital, large enough to alter the entire trajectory of my professional existence. I did not utilize the reward money to purchase frivolous luxury vehicles or finance extravagant international vacations. I respected the immense power of liquid currency far too much to waste it on superficial vanity. Instead, I drove directly to the commercial real estate district overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. I signed a multi-year commercial lease on a beautiful, sunlit office space featuring gorgeous hardwood floors and massive windows facing the rolling ocean waves. I officially established my own independent financial compliance firm. I hired a small staff of brilliant, dedicated junior auditors. I purchased premium ergonomic furniture and installed state-of-the-art encrypted server networks. I transitioned from a subordinate hospital employee into a highly respected corporate executive building an unassailable reputation for dismantling complex institutional fraud. Every single morning I unlocked the glass doors of my coastal enterprise, feeling an incredible surge of profound satisfaction. My former relatives had desperately attempted to use me as a sacrificial shield. They manufactured an elaborate, cruel deception to force me to absorb their catastrophic failures. They wanted me to pay their toxic bills and suffer the devastating consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. But their malicious strategy backfired with magnificent, poetic perfection. In the end, they paid for my entire future. Families are very much like towering oak trees. From the outside, they often appear unshakable, deeply rooted in the soil of tradition, shared history, and mutual obligation. But if the core of the trunk is hollowed out by deceit, favoritism, and unspoken resentments, it only takes a single powerful storm to bring the entire canopy crashing down. The story of Miyuki Garcia and the catastrophic collapse of her family's logistics empire is on its surface a thrilling tale of corporate espionage, offshore syndicates, and a brilliant auditor exacting her ultimate vengeance. Yet if we strip away the federal indictments, the stolen millions, and the cinematic hotel lobby confrontations, what remains is a deeply personal, chilling cautionary tale about the fundamental failures of parenting. It is a story about what happens when the sacred duties of raising a child are corrupted by a lack of emotional awareness, the absence of fairness, and the toxic desire to protect a family's public image at the expense of its own soul. In many traditional family structures, particularly within the fiercely independent and success-driven landscape of American culture, there is an immense unspoken pressure to project absolute perfection. Javier and Rosa Garcia fell into the most ancient and destructive of parental traps, the creation of a golden child and a scapegoat. They looked at Elena and saw an extension of their own egos, the beautiful, untouchable face of their legacy. They looked at Miyuki and saw merely a utility, a structural foundation meant to bear the weight of their own shortcomings. When parents fail to distribute fairness evenly, they do not just cultivate sibling rivalry, they actively manufacture long-term dysfunction. By constantly shielding Elena from the consequences of her actions, from casually forging a high school report card to recklessly mismanaging a corporate empire, Javier and Rosa believed they were demonstrating profound family loyalty. In reality, they were raising a predator. They starved their eldest daughter of the most crucial lesson a developing child must learn: accountability. Honesty and fairness are not just moral buzzwords meant for Sunday school. They are the load-bearing beams of a child's psychological development. When parents abandon these principles to coddle a favorite child, they strip that child of their ability to navigate the real world ethically. The Garcias thought they were protecting their daughter, but by insulating her from reality, they ultimately handed her the silver fountain pen she used to sign her own federal prison sentence. Conversely, the horrific manner in which the Garcias treated Miyuki highlights a profound lack of emotional awareness. True family responsibility should mean nurturing every child's potential, recognizing their unique emotional needs, and offering a safe harbor from the world. Instead, Miyuki was treated as a disposable asset. The bizarre, cruel theater of holding a living funeral to formally disown her was the ultimate manifestation of parental betrayal. It is a stark reminder that children are not blind. They are hyper-aware of the emotional currents flowing through their homes. They internalize the unstated rules, the quiet biases, and the constantly shifting goalposts. When a child realizes that their unconditional love and obedience will never be enough to earn their parents' genuine respect, they are forced to make an agonizing choice: submit and be crushed beneath the weight of expectation, or walk away and survive. Miyuki chose survival, but the profound tragedy is that she had to emotionally die to her family to do so. True parenting requires the emotional intelligence to see children for who they truly are, not for what they can do to serve the family's bottom line. In American culture, where self-reliance is heavily prized alongside family values, a healthy home must bridge the gap between individual ambition and unconditional support. If a family only values a child for their utility, in Miyuki's case, her immaculate credit score and her ability to clean up messes, it ceases to be a family and becomes a ruthless corporation. And corporations, as the Garcias learned the hard way, are always subject to audits. The chilling climax of Miyuki's story, where she calmly hands her weeping mother a black garbage bag filled with shredded lies, is simply the harvest of seeds planted decades earlier. Long-term guidance for children is not about securing their financial future. It is about securing their moral compass. The Garcias spent their entire adult lives building a regional logistics empire, prioritizing wealth, social status, and the illusion of power over the difficult, unglamorous, everyday work of raising decent human beings. They confused enabling with loving. They mistook extortion for family duty. When the federal authorities swarmed that Mississippi hotel courtyard, they were simply enforcing the boundaries that Javier and Rosa should have firmly established when their daughters were still living under their roof. The lesson here is absolute. If parents do not teach their children to respect boundaries, the world will eventually do it for them, and the world's lessons are rarely gentle. Raising children with honesty means having the courage to let them fail. It means letting them feel the sting of a bad grade or a poor financial decision so they do not grow up believing they are immune to consequence. It requires parents to possess the emotional maturity to confront their own biases, to look in the mirror and ask themselves if they are loving their children equally, or if they are simply playing favorites to soothe their own deeply rooted insecurities. We consume stories like Miyuki's because they offer a profound sense of catharsis. We cheer when the ledger is balanced, when the bullies are dethroned, and when justice is delivered with meticulous mathematical precision. But the true value of these narratives lies in the uncomfortable reflections they cast upon our own lives and relationships. If you find yourself captivated by these intricate tales of betrayal, resilience, and the ultimate balancing of the scales, I highly encourage you to follow the channel Morning Revenge. There, we continue to explore the deep, often shadowed corners of human relationships, bringing you stories that challenge your perspective, validate your struggles, and keep you on the edge of your seat. It is a dedicated community for those who appreciate the raw truth of consequence and the quiet, undeniable power of a meticulously executed comeback. As the dust settles on the Garcia family's ruined empire, we are left to ponder the quiet rooms of our own homes. The most terrifying monsters do not always lurk in the shadows of offshore syndicates or dark alleyways. Sometimes they sit right across from us at the dining room table, casually passing the salt. Every single decision we make as parents, every blind eye we turn to bad behavior, every moral standard we compromise in the name of keeping the peace, weaves the fabric of our children's futures. Are we building sturdy storm shelters rooted in truth and mutual respect, or are we actively constructing fragile glass houses just waiting for the inevitable boulder to fall? Look closely at the faces of those you are raising, and then look closely at yourself. The ledger of family life is always open, and the ink is never truly dry.